All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to day two of the Asia Regional Forum hosted by Free the Slaves and several other partners. This is an important space where we're trying to understand some of the issues that are happening in the Asia region. And of course, this will be feeding in to a very important narrative document that we'll be sharing in the chat where we can construct a global narrative of what the anti-trafficking space needs now. Yesterday, we addressed issues of empowerment, and specifically empowerment that looks at equipping individuals and communities with the knowledge, tools, and resources they need to resist and overcome exploitation. We discussed education and awareness. We discussed economic empowerment and creating those opportunities, and legal empowerment through several case studies. Today, however, and I'm a little biased in this, we're going to be discussing one of my favorite pillars, and I think something that's the most important, and that's exposure. So, exposure is about shedding light on this issue. I'm one of the founding authors of the Global Slavery Index, and I've worked on the global estimates of modern slavery. I'm a statistician who measures modern slavery, of course, and I've seen firsthand the impact that good research and good publication of that research can have on ending modern slavery in our fields. I think that this informs a lot of policy decisions now. I think that this is the way to really highlight the types of trafficking that are happening. And now, as we have a lot more regulations and laws coming up in Europe and throughout the world that govern supply chains, I think that this is an opportunity to really use some of those investigative skills to change how exploitation is occurring. I think today, when we discuss issues around research and data collection, media and storytelling, transparency in supply chains, and government accountability, we're really addressing the key components of how do we deliver technical knowledge to potentially non-expert audiences that will still non-technical audiences that will still be making important decisions. And that's an important component with media and storytelling. We all invest so much money in research and data collection, but that's not as useful if that can't be crafted into something that can be easily understood and then turned into policy change. There's so many examples from the last 15 years I've spent in this field, but I think a lot of the work that I've overseen as a director of Free the Slaves, I'm on their board of directors, has been really interesting because we're looking at the impacts of climate change, which, as the regional narrative for the Caribbean highlights, is a major area of concern. We're looking at new regulatory frameworks throughout Europe that'll have, as I've mentioned, impacts throughout the rest of the world. And we're also looking really at how disregard for human rights and labor rights and what results in human exploitation in the form of modern slavery will also generally have a comorbidity with a disregard for environmental safeguards and other critical protections that we have in place. So I think as we start to address modern slavery, we have huge intersections with the environmental rights communities. And I think that there's a great potential there for our fields to work closely together. Today, we're going to start with a panel on research and data collection. I'll introduce that panel's moderator in a second. Then we'll have a case study on a presentation on case studies and storytelling. Then we're going to be looking at cyber slavery and the dark side of digital platforms. And then talking, our final panel for the day will be focused on transparency and accountability before we move into a session with my good friend, Dr. Brooke Bella, who's going to be talking about building a movement narrative. That's kind of the overview for today. And we'll have Dr. Giselle Balfour here as well to help with any housekeeping or other critical items. We'll be tag teaming, I suppose you could say, some of the leadership for this. And as a note, we have a chat function here. So please feel free to introduce yourself, your organization, where you're messaging in from. And if you have any questions, please put that in the Q&A section where that'll be then transmitted to our speakers and panelists and moderators. For those of us joining on our YouTube stream, please feel free to add comments there as well, and we'll do our best to feed those into our Q&A in this chat. So without much further ado, we can move right into our first panel discussion on research and data collection, the current trends and data on modern slavery in Asia. And this panel will be providing an analysis of current trends and data related to modern slavery in Asia. My friend and colleague, Dr. Marta Furlan, will be leading this session, and I have to say that I've thoroughly enjoyed serving on the institutional review board that with Dr. Furlan, as we've discussed some of the research projects that Free the Slaves has undertaken. Her thoughtfulness and her consideration for so many areas of human-driven research is really compelling, and I know that she'll add a lot of valuable perspectives to this panel. And even though I've worked with Marta in the past, and she's a senior program manager for research of Free the Slaves, I also just learned new things about her, that she's a non-resident fellow at the Center on Armed Groups, and that she's at the Orion Policy Institute. She's an incredible researcher and an incredible asset to our team, and I'm so thrilled to pass the baton over to you, Marta.
Thank you so much, Darvina, for your introductory remarks. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this research panel of the Freedom from Slavery Asia Regional Forum, entitled, as Darvina said, Current Trends and Data on Modern Slavery in Asia. My name is Marta Furlan. I'm Free the Slaves Senior Program Manager for Research, and I have the pleasure to be the moderator of this research-focused panel. Alongside me on this panel is a group of brilliant experts from across the Asia region. We have Ranjana Sharma, participatory action researcher from SeaWish, based in Nepal; Carmina Domingo, program director for the Philippines at Elizon Foundation; and Mustafa Kadri, founder and CEO of Equidem. In this panel, we are going to discuss current trends in modern slavery in Asia, building on research projects and data collection efforts carried out by each of the organizations represented in this panel. A couple of words on the logistics. As Darvina already introduced, each panelist will offer a brief presentation based on their work in the region. We'll then follow a discussion aimed at delving more in depth into some of the topics emerged from the presentations. And afterwards, we will open the floor to questions from the audience, which I invite you to write in the Q&A chat box. Now, in my role as Free the Slaves Senior Program Manager for Research, I will get this fascinating conversation started by offering a brief presentation on our recent research in the Asia region. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the intersection between climate change and human trafficking, which, while certainly not unique to Asia, is a major challenge for this region, and one that is set to grow further in the years to come unless prompt and resolute action is taken. Last year, Free the Slaves and JPIC IDC, our Philippines-based partner, carried out a research project on climate change and human trafficking in the Philippines to understand how climate change, broadly meant in its different manifestations, is affecting vulnerability to human trafficking. In fact, it is easily understood that climate change, as any other major challenge, and we can think of COVID-19 just a few years ago, can have a negative impact on people's resilience to exploitation. However, what is less understood is the exact pathways through which climate change is exacerbating vulnerability. From our research, it emerged that communities with inadequate preparation strategies, so inadequate strategies to prepare for the harmful effects of a changing climate, and communities with inadequate recovery strategies, so inadequate strategies to recover from the effects that the changing climate may have, are prone to increased vulnerability. Specifically, we identified 5 pathways through which climate change exacerbates vulnerability to modern slavery. And a clarification here, this is not meant as an exhaustive list. There are many other ways through which climate change can impact negatively on vulnerability to human trafficking, but I am referring here specifically to those that emerged from our research. First, poverty. Individuals whose livelihoods depend on the environment find themselves in a situation of economic uncertainty. But this also affects individuals who can no longer engage in their traditional activities, for instance, school teachers, drivers, electricians. So individuals who lose their traditional activities are exposed to the risk of unemployment in the long term. Second, displacement. Those unable to repair their house that got damaged, or those that lost their employment, may find themselves in a situation in which they are forced to leave their home and are forced to relocate, either in a different town within the same country or even abroad. Food insecurity is the third pathway that we identified. Since climate change undermines the community's food supplies and the community's capacity to provide food regularly and sustainably, what is typically observed in a situation of climate change is widespread food insecurity. We also have health insecurity, the destruction of infrastructure and medical supplies, and the direct damages that climate change may have on people, health conditions, injuries, create health problems. Also, it is important to know that economic hardships often force people to cut their medical expenses. Families may prefer to use their money to buy food rather than to buy medicaments. And finally, lack of education. The destruction of infrastructure affects negatively education opportunities, but again, economic hardships also play a role. Families that are impoverished, where the household heads lost their job, may have to cut the direct and indirect costs of education. So as communities and individuals find themselves in condition of heightened vulnerability in context of climate change, human traffickers are well positioned to come into the picture, take advantage of affected individuals for purposes of exploitation. However, what is perhaps less commonly thought of is that families are also prone to resort to harmful coping strategies that may be conducive to exploitation. So building on the findings of our research that point to a connection between vulnerability to climate change and vulnerability to modern slavery, what we suggest is that actions that can strengthen communities' resilience vis-à-vis the adverse impact of climate change are fundamental to ultimately strengthen communities' resilience to modern slavery. So we are suggesting an approach that aims to build a bridge when it comes to climate response and modern slavery responses. I will now stop here my brief presentation, and I will invite Ranjana Sharma from Seawish to take the floor.
Thank you, Martha. Hello, everybody. My name is Ranjana Sharma, and I'm working in a series for last 5 years as a researcher. And my area of expertise has been modern day slavery and child labor. And as a series organization itself has been working for last 30 years as a pioneer organization in the child labor sector, especially domestic child workers. And it is quite interesting since I'm doing a recent research with Free the Slave and Martha. And I went for a study and collection of data. And what I found is all the human resource that has been trained in the domestic child worker are from they have either worked with the civis organization or they are trained from the civis organization. So I can proudly say I'm working with an organization who have been working in the domestic child worker sector, but we are not limited to that only because our core area of things have been like child rights, child protection, child education, and recently we also added climate change in that because as Martha was mentioning how climate change is very much a burning issue these days for all the sectors that we have been working. And cities have also started that along with the family empowerment programs. And we have been doing advocacy and lobby in the sector for quite a long time on the child domestic sector and child labor sector. And we are currently working with around 60 to 70 municipalities of Nepal. And we have already achieved like 9 to 10 policy changes from our organization through our effort of our organizations like green flag movements and all that. And I, being a researcher, I quite think like why we have to do so much of advocacy. We are doing advocacy for such a long time and such changes in that. But recently, when I happened to talk to one of the key person from the Ministry of Nepal, I was surprised. Like she doesn't even she's working as a child protection officer in the ministry, and she doesn't have any knowledge about the child labor sector. So that's like this is important. Why advocacy and lobby that we are doing in the sectors is quite interesting for us. And we are not limited. Our organization is not only limited to that because we have been doing different projects on the disabilities and the climate issues. But disability and climate issue is quite interestingly very like less aware issue within Nepal because I can very frankly tell you that like people are not so much aware at the policy level, at the local level. And since the changes in the political system of the Nepal, there are so many human resource that has been newly recruited or have been shifted from one location to another, and one might have awareness and the working in one sector but does not have much of the awareness and knowledge about this child life, climate change, and disability sectors issues. So it's very important for organization like us to continue our advocacy and lobbying work and doing a research work. And I recently was engaged in a Clarissa project, which was funded by the UK government, and the Clarissa was especially focused on the child labor sector, especially the adult entertainment sector. And the adult entertainment sector is quite another interesting aspect of the modern day slavery, where there is you cannot simply say like, okay, this is the trend or this is the thing. There are so many different things that are going on, and the intersections are within the sector. There are cross sectionality and so many things, like within a sector also you will find how the formal and informal sectors are connected to each other. And while I was reading the paper also, it's mentioned, like it's clearly been said, like how the formal sector is giving birth to an informal sector, and how the children are getting engaged in informal sector, which is more hidden from our eyes and our own like research aspect, because we want to do a research and we want to find out what is happening. But what is possible for us is to go through what is shown to us or what is visible to us, but what are hidden there, it's very difficult for organization like us also to find. But we are continuously working towards that to find out through our organization research work, advocacy and lobby work, how we can change this. Talking about the trends in the domestic child worker, which is quite interesting because my recent work is on that, like how 20 years or 15 years back the children were not even sent to the school, but at least now they are the children working in child domestic sector are sent to the school. But the narrative of the employers are like, we are giving them an opportunity, it's like they are doing a charity for them. So these kind of trends we can see, like what is coming from our recent work, our 30 years of work. But trend has been changing, but still the issue is still there. Exploitation and abuses are still there. That's why our organization is supporting those children with the legal cases of the sexual abuses and the exploitation. So those kind of things we have been working for quite a long time. And talking about the adult entertainment sector, I just want to share a couple of key findings or interesting findings. Like we think children are working, they are working and we should go and help them. But interestingly, these children does not even share among their peers or family members that they are working in this sector. So the risks of the mental health, physical health become quite very big for them, because they haven't shared it with anyone. And even talking to us, they were quite hesitant initially, but gradually with the rapport building and all that, we continued our work in the research. And one thing I will definitely like to say, as an organization and learning from all this research work and our effort on advocacy and awareness, is we should keep on continuing this, but we should not forget, like these sectors are quite interconnected with each other. And in our future aspects also, research project or advocacy and lobby thing, we need to come up with a holistic kind of programs that can support not only one aspect of the child. Like we should not only talk about the family empowerment or children empowerment, but we should also look from the aspects of the owners that has started this kind of business like adult entertainment sector, because these owners themselves are vulnerable, because often the people who take the children for trafficking or giving them an employment, they don't have, they are operating at a very marginalized limit, so they don't have other option or choices to do. And they are not, when we think business, we think like they are oh my god, they have a business, they know what should be done about the child labor, about the modern day slavery, but they are not aware on what is happening in the society, what are the laws and rules and regulations. And since they are operating on a very less profit, so they are not in a position to bring the changes, but they can be a catalyst to a changes. So we have to understand that. And as an organization also, we have been doing that. We have been collecting the voices of the children, of the women, and putting it in a participatory form and bringing it into the platforms at the national and international forums like this one and at the UN. Yeah, thank you so much. That's from my side.
Thank you so much, Ranjana, for sharing about your research work on different aspects of child labor in Nepal. I will now invite Carmina Domingo from Elizon Foundation to offer her presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Marda. Hello, everyone. Good day. Again, I am Ina from Elizon Foundation. I'm from Cebu, Philippines. I'm very honored to be here and to share insights into Elazon's work on community-based participatory research, particularly our use of photo voice to amplify survivor leadership in research. So since 2016, our team at Alazon has been dedicated to implementing community-based participatory research. So some of you may know this in its acronym CBPR. So at Alazon, all of our photo voice research has been done in collaboration with survivors of human trafficking. So for reference, for others that may have heard CBPR for the first time, community-based participatory research is a collaborative approach where researchers and community members work together throughout the research process. This collaboration ensures that the research is relevant and beneficial to the community involved. This approach helps us address the needs of the community in a way that respects and leverages their expertise and experiences. So our work at Alazon is very diverse. It involves a lot of aspects of mental health and reintegration support interventions. However, today I want to focus on one of our recent and significant projects, which is the use of photo voice to explore and elevate survivor leadership. So for photo voice, it is an arts-based, community-based participatory research method. So it's a type of CBPR. It is grounded in feminist theory, empowerment theory, critical consciousness, and document photography. So this particular research approach combines the power of photography with grassroots activism. Through photographs, community members, in this case, survivor leaders, are able to take photos to show their own experience, promote dialogue within their community, and mobilize change that is led by the survivors themselves or by the community. So this approach prioritizes sharing power. It also gives community members the power to control how one's own experiences are represented. So our recent study, just conducted this year, 2024, is the fourth in a series of photo voice projects. It is aimed to define survivor leadership. So the goal of our research is to create a framework for survivor leadership that is deeply rooted in the experiences and perspectives of Southeast Asian survivors. In this latest study, survivors were not just participants in the research, but co-leaders. This means that survivor leaders are central to the entire research process. Survivor leaders lead every aspect of the research, including data collection, data analysis, identifying of the problem, coming up with the solutions, and later on sharing of the findings. So through photo voice, our survivors or survivor leaders capture the journey and thoughts through images, using photography to articulate experiences that sometimes words alone could not express or convey. These images spark meaningful dialogue, cultivate empathy, challenge misconceptions, and influence key stakeholders. We also utilized photo voice because this approach also explicitly prioritizes social action and advocacy as key outcomes of the research. By amplifying survivor voices, it ensures that survivors' perspective shape anti-trafficking initiatives authentically and meaningfully. We have found, or through this research, by co-leading with survivors, or survivor-led studies, such as this recent photo voice study on survivor leadership, underscore the importance of really centering survivor voices in research and highlight how survivors' leadership can drive meaningful and impactful change. So, in summary, our work and research at Alazon illustrates that when survivors are given tools and platforms to lead, the outcomes are not only more insightful, but also more empowering. By continuing to employ and refine participatory methods like photo voice, we therefore can enhance our understanding and response to the needs of survivors, ultimately fostering more effective and compassionate support systems. So that was just a summary. Thank you for the opportunity to share with this work. I look forward to engaging in further discussions about and advancing these important conversations.
Thank you so much, Ina, for sharing your work on community-based research and the leading role of survivors. I think it was both interesting and inspirational. And I will now invite Mustafa Quadri from Equidem to take the floor.
Thank you, Marta. And it's such a pleasure to be on the panel today and to hear from the other panelists. Really looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have today. So firstly, as an introduction, my name is Mustafa Kadri. I'm the CEO of Equidem. We are a global human rights and labor rights organization, and we work across Asia in a number of contexts. What makes us a little bit unique is that whilst we do a range of investigations, typically into global supply chains, the majority of our team, and in fact, all of our investigators, are workers and survivors of modern slavery. And so this gives us a lot of insight into the realities that people impacted by modern slavery face. But critically, also, it has given us a chance to think about not just documenting a problem, but how do we resolve those issues through actually supporting survival leadership. So this panel today is really a great opportunity for me to talk about some of our experiences, but also to learn from all of you, including those who have joined the panel. Obviously, Asia is such a diverse continent, arguably one of the most diverse on Earth, and it's one of the great engine rooms of the global economy and the global labor market. And whilst Asia is diverse, one of the things that really unites it is a shared experience of economic growth and turbulence, and of course, global linkages that sadly are also reflected in modern slavery risks. Critically, however, it is also one of the most exciting spaces for organizing survivors, workers, and for survivor leadership to address modern slavery. Now, our work at Equidem, it covers a range of different geographies, but most of our work focuses on South Asia and Southeast Asia, as well as Asian workers that travel to the Arab Gulf region in a range of industries. And that's born out of a very simple logic, which is to say that as much as there are challenges with what survivors and workers will face, there are huge opportunities not just to address these issues, but to actually organize people in a context that seems to transcend political allegiances. With the work that our team does across South Asia, Southeast Asia, finding workers in many different contexts, we're really struck by the fact that, number one, the challenges that workers and survivors face, there may be qualitative differences, but fundamentally they're the same experiences that they face. But also, because our team are themselves workers in places like Malaysia, places like the United Arab Emirates, Hong Kong, or Singapore, that they find that workers and survivors organically are collaborating with one another. And often, it's a very obvious point. It is a matter of survival, because when you are in a situation of distress, then you are seeking out those that will help you. And of course, others who have a similar situation to you or have a consciousness about what you're facing are naturally gravitating towards supporting you. However, what it also means is that it's allowed us to get really strong data to drive for change. And so one thing I wanted to do in the short time that we've got, I mean, it's impossible to really cover everything, but to talk very briefly about some of the trends that we're seeing in the work that we're doing. And obviously very happy to delve into that, interrogate that in more detail if people have specific questions. But a couple of things that really have struck out for us in the last 12 months, 2 years, we've seen, at least in the data that we've been collecting across a range of sectors, that there is an increased inequality across Asia that is obviously driving people for work in situations that are very, very often risky, where there's a high amount of precarity, and often where people are aware of the risks. But despite that, because of economic pressures on them, that is making them make these journeys. And people are really exploiting those situations. So the risks of trafficking, exploitation in the recruitment process, and also exploitation in the work context have really increased. And underlying that, of course, is an awareness often by the perpetrator that government regulators are either weak or in some situations might even be complicit in that exploitation. And a deep awareness by those who might exploit workers and survivors that they can do this with impunity. And so that's something that's really marked out the work that we've done. Obviously, documenting things that have been happening for a very long time, but I've been really struck by that. Even our own worker teams, we've noticed that they've also found that they face and their communities are facing huge economic pressures, the increase in the cost of living, the changes in the job market to more precarious, less long-term work. That's an issue which is really driving modern slavery risks and has also positively led to more discussions around social protection. The fact that there's an awareness around not only do I need to find gainful employment or a livelihood with dignity, but that the state and society owes me that social protection. And that there's a whole life cycle element to my experience that goes beyond just the point that I get trapped in exploitation and addressing that exploitation, but that I, as a human being and as a citizen, need to be reintegrated into society, be put back on my feet because I've given back to society. Critically, also, what we find is that workers have a strong awareness of not just that sense of their rights and what the society owes to them in their country of origin, but also for those that travel overseas or to another region of their country, that wherever they may be based, that they're very much part of that society. And workers may not, and survivors may not actually mention it in those terms, but it's very clear that they have that awareness there. And our sense is that there's something really there to harness and to perhaps tap into that as an organizing opportunity. Another element that we notice in our work is, and others have mentioned this, and I'm really glad that in this discussion broadly in the forum, we're talking about the linkages between climate and modern slavery. Marta, the research that you mentioned as well, it's really great that you're focusing on that because again, quite organically with our research, we've really noticed this in a number of contexts. So for example, when it comes to agricultural workers in India, internal migration is very significant, but the climate impacts are very significant too. Now, this is on a range of areas and can be very complex. The obvious areas are around obviously heat stress and the physical conditions that survivors and workers may face in situations that amount to modern slavery, but also, of course, it is driving migration too. In other contexts, we're seeing that workers across Asia are traveling overseas because of the devastation of climate change. I and my colleagues have spoken to workers that have talked about climate change and fleeing those conditions as if they're fleeing a war zone, which is really quite astonishing. Myself being a lawyer by background, you often struggle to think of whether there's a causal link factually between climate change and modern slavery. And yet in these cases, you see very, very clearly that not only are those linkages there, but survivors and workers are really aware of that. And so for me, that's also really significant because along with this obviously being an emerging crisis for the planet, much of the international system is much more activated on climate change than it is around modern slavery. And I do feel that there's an opportunity for us, not just to be addressing modern slavery through the climate link, but through that climate link, also getting affected communities to be part of that conversation. And that's something very much that we look at. And finally, although certainly by no means the only other thing to talk about, but one other thing I wanted to talk about was the gender component. Now, that obviously comes out in a number of different ways. And the most obvious way to think about it is in terms of the impact on girls and women around the things that I mentioned before, inequality, economic pressures, climate change. But obviously, it is actually gender across the board. And that means that you also have male workers, other workers with other forms of identity, deeply impacted by those issues, by climate change and inequality, economic impacts that lead to not only a risk of modern slavery, but also an invisibility, even amongst the modern slavery movement, anti-modern slavery movement, a level of invisibility and hidden forms of exploitation and oppression that we really need to break down. One simple example that I can give is around some research that we've done in relation to the garment sector in Bangladesh, where there were many situations where the predominantly female workforce were in situations of incredible heat stress in the factory floors and facing a range of gendered forms of harm that were integrated into the way that many businesses and employers were operating, but also were very difficult for these workers and survivors to complain about. And so that is another area that we're seeing across the board. Of course, like I said, it's not just an issue for women and girls, although obviously that is a key area of concern around the gender component. But even with male workers, an area that we've seen, for example, is in the platform economy in Indonesia, where you have drivers for a number of delivery apps and gig apps facing a range of modern slavery indicators, facing heat stress, and that because of their gender, that's actually increasing the kind of exploitation that they face and certain assumptions about the work conditions that they can tolerate. And of course, an idea by the employers that, anyone who complains about these situations is a reflection of them being weak and a poor worker. So I found that is an area as well that we've really noticed and really key to the work that we're doing in the data collection that we've got. I'll finally end on one key point, although again, there's so much to really talk about, and that is around the centrality of making sure that we, in our data collection, are giving ownership to survivors, ownership to workers, and using that data in a way to have an impact, not just in terms of addressing harm, but around empowering the people that are most impacted. Now, in our organization, we have a mixture of experts from around the world, as well as activists and survivors and workers from very, very diverse backgrounds. And, it's been a real effort on our part over the last number of years to try to have these mixed experience, mixed expertise teams put together to do often very, very sensitive investigations. And the one thing that always comes out from our survivor and worker staff is how important to them it is to be not just documenting issues, but to also be finding ways to address the problem systematically, but also empowering workers. And so much of our work is around supporting existing survivor-led networks, worker-led networks in a range of countries. The key thing that we've seen is just how rewarding it is when you do that approach, because then you are able to shift very rapidly from problem statement setting through documentation to trying to actually have an intervention to address issues. Having said that, we're seeing across the board, and again, we don't have the data at that scale to say whether this is a broad trend, but at least anecdotally, we're seeing that civic space is broadly shrinking, that particularly survivors, workers, the most vulnerable people that are part of our movement and yet are the most important part of it, are particularly at risk from a range of actors, be they state or non-state, because of their activities as anti-modern slavery activists. And that is why forums like this are so important for us to knowledge share, to show solidarity, and to also put pressure on states and other powerful actors to protect the status of these survivor activists and human rights defenders, which in many ways is already enshrined in international law, if in reality most states have not acceded to any kind of hard legal instruments to reflect that. And I think that's really, really key, because with the issues around inequality, climate change, other social upheavals that we're seeing in the Asian region, the challenges, the risks around modern slavery will only grow. And therefore, the critical role of survivor leadership is also really necessary. But if there isn't that strength, that solidarity to provide that protection for those survivor leadership, my fear is that we will really rapidly lose the gains that we've made despite the challenges. So I leave there feeling that there's still so much to talk about, that noting the time as well. Marta, I'll return to you. But again, thank you so much for having me in this panel. I'm really enjoying being part of it.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. This has been a very interesting start. It has been great to listen to the research expertise that each of you is bringing to the conversation. And I found it great also to reflect on some areas where our research efforts seem to be converging, such as the linkage between climate change and human trafficking, but also the importance of participatory research approaches where we do research with the communities rather than in the communities. And I will now open to the floor to the audience for making questions. I see that some of our participants already typed their questions in the Q&A chat and invite others to do so as well. So first question, how can collaboration between researchers, government, NGOs, and the private sector enhance efforts to combat human trafficking? And perhaps each of you can starting with Ranjana, going to Carmina, and then Mustafa can answer very briefly to this question.
Thank you for the question and thank you, Martha. Regarding this collaboration, I have a very interesting example to share from the Claricide stuff because in Claricide it was like we were working with the children, but then we were in an adaptive management process. So we revised the whole process and so we also started working with business owners who were from the informal sector, like small snacks houses and all that. And when we worked with them and we had action research groups with them, what we found is like instead of us going and telling them or children going and asking them to bring the changes when they themselves realize like how important and why this is important for their business itself, then that collaboration become very sustainable and they took the ownership and they bring the changes in the old sectors like introducing the proper contract documents to the employers or not hiring anybody below 18. So those kind of collaboration, that is one example that I can give. And definitely if we start working with the different stakeholders in this kind of manner, it can bring good changes in the society.
Thank you for the question, Dr. Marta. For us at Liaison, we found that this was actually one of the results or key themes found from this recent research conducted with survivor leaders, that it's important to really center survivor voices in the work. So as you mentioned, Dr. Marta, for a while, the trend has been for us for years, the trend has been for usually to conduct research where survivors are just participants in the research process. But it's very important for survivors to not just be participants, but like co-leaders in research to take a more active role. And so I think in terms of collaboration, to really ask survivor leaders or survivors about possible collaboration, like in which areas, instead of organizations or government agencies saying that this is the type of research that we should work on with survivors, or this is how we should collaborate. Maybe going directly to those who are impacted by modern day slavery, or in this case, or in our work at a liaison, human trafficking, what specific areas or how can we collaborate better with you? We started asking this from our survivors in the research, and we found that there are a lot of areas to improve on. So for instance, survivor leaders mentioned that there are a lot of programs in the government, but they're at the receiving end, towards the end. They're not part of the discussion of thinking through the problems, finding the solution. It's just, this is what we think you need, and so you accept it. And so survivors are not really, their actual needs are not represented, not identified, and therefore are not part of the solution. So long discussion, but just a brief summary, Dr. Marta.
Thanks for the question, Marta. I'm not sure how much I can add to what others have said. I think one key thing that comes to mind is that we, as was said by others, that when you include survivor leadership and survivor voice, what really comes out is typically the state authorities and others will view modern slavery, human trafficking as a criminal justice issue. And of course it is. But that means also that you're taking very much a law enforcement lens, and that you're viewing the victim purely as a victim, that there's a crime, address the crime and move on. And what we hear constantly from the survivors that we interact with, and even in our own team, is that there is a completely three-dimensional picture that you need to understand. It's a person that is like anyone else, trying to live a life of dignity and improve their life. And so that means that, in fact, there are situations where you can have that discussion with state authorities, regulators, often employers, that it is finding the right contact point to have that conversation. We've worked in a number of projects across Asia where we've been brought in to do an investigation around modern slavery or human trafficking, where you have, for example, an employer that's very much actually interested in addressing those points. And what I've really been struck by is that you have in some situations, quite large companies with their local subsidiary, the local staff at the executive level, often young executives, so the young talent within the local business community that are really activated by addressing this issue, but they don't interact with people from the communities that are impacted by modern slavery or human trafficking. And when they have those interactions, they realize there's actually a commonality. So whereas that in certain situations, there will be conflict between businesses and victims, survivors of modern slavery, that in fact there is seeing eye to eye on certain situations. And so for us, that's been really, really comforting, because then, of course, there is an incredible amount of authority that survivors can speak with. And we see our role very much as trying to facilitate those discussions, but also guiding both parties, but particularly the survivors, around the best approach to taking those discussions. And all of a sudden, what happens, and I'm sure others listening have seen this as well, is that many of the actors, whether it's local government, employers, when they hear about human trafficking, modern slavery, they often bristle because they think, oh gosh, the police will get involved. It's a criminal matter. It's so bad for our reputation. And of course, that should happen if a crime is being committed. But the point is to say that there's more to it, and there's actually something that you can be involved in to address these issues. But it has to start with listening to the victim, who is actually a human being. They're not just this sort of cartoon image of what a victim might be. But I might leave it there.
Thank you so much, Mustafa, Ranjana, and Ina, for your answers. There is another question from our audience on how can research effectively contribute to the identification and prevention of human trafficking and modern slavery, and what challenges as researchers have you faced in this regard? Perhaps Mustafa, this time, would you like to start, and then we go to Ranjan and Ina?
Yeah, absolutely. And mindful, I spoke for a long time before, so I'll be very quick, is look, there are a range of obviously challenges. Firstly, because our team are themselves survivors, it means that there's a lot of risk, obviously, in terms of them facing reprisal in certain situations where there's a strong linkage between the perpetrator and local law enforcement, which is often sadly common. That can mean that they can even face potentially criminal penalties. Although we're very, very careful around the research that we do, and the methodology and the safeguarding that we design is very much focused around doing things in a very legally compliant way. But that's one very big risk. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack in that, but I'll leave it there. I think another area is around managing expectations. The reality is that when you're doing research or data collection to do with human trafficking, modern slavery, forced labor, labor exploitation, you're dealing with people in incredible distress. And we always try to, as I mentioned before, integrate some kind of remedy aspect to the research that we do. But the reality is, number one, these are traumatized people, these are frustrated people. Your ability to make those impacts is very limited. And you often have a situation where people are not happy to actually interact with you. And that often changes. But you have to find ways to address that and have empathy. And fundamentally, that goes down to, there's so much to this, but informed consent and being survivor-led in that research process. So that can be really challenging because there's a range of ethical things that you need to be thinking about. And there will be situations where you feel there's something very significant that you're documenting, and an intervention can be made. But the rights holder is the one that is queen. They have to be the one that gives you the direction to take. So that is, I'd say, probably two very big challenges that we face.
On my end, or for our end at the liaison, so research for the longest time provides crucial data regarding recent trends patterns. So in this case, research provides information on prevalence patterns and causes of human trafficking and modern day slavery, helping us identify at-risk populations and inform prevention strategies. By getting information from research, academic, independent funded research, we're able to use the findings to then guide the development of laws and interventions, both in the legal frameworks, but also in the victim support services. At the same time, research raises public awareness, especially if it's an open access or that research is accessible to the community, allowing systemic change, influencing policymakers and stakeholders. And very importantly, since I have discussed photo voice or community-based participatory research earlier, and as Mustafa mentioned, it's very important to highlight survivor voices in research. This ensures that interventions meet real needs and evaluates the effectiveness of support services. Challenges I think that we've seen is data collection, so limited access to survivors or underreporting, ethical concerns about safety and confidentiality. There's also, if we're also going to be honest, there's resource or limitations in resources, inadequate funding, support, maybe infrastructures, the difficulty of coordination between government agencies, non-government agencies, other networks, and I think just in general, also ethical reporting. So balancing awareness with sensitivity to avoid sensationalism and also respecting survivors' privacy. So very briefly, Dr. Marta, I know we have time.
Yes, thank you so much to each of you for your brief but very clear answers to this important question. We have 5 minutes for one last question. I see that two people from the audience asked about what can be done to strengthen the challenge that we were outlining before on communities being vulnerable to the combined threat of modern slavery and climate change. So perhaps I can share some thoughts on this based on research by Freed Slaves and JPIC IDC in the Philippines. Considering this double challenge, we are advocating for a wall of society approach in which different actors take part in these efforts. For instance, when it comes to the government, we recommend to strengthen the capacity of local communities in climate change affected areas or areas that are most exposed to these threats of climate change. For instance, by providing accurate information on climate threats, but also providing information and resources on how to prepare accurately. Many people that we spoke with when doing this research told us that they don't even know what preparation would look like, how they can go navigate this. So I think the government here would have an important role to play, but also introduce human trafficking considerations into sustainable development programs and climate change policies. So rather than addressing these issues in silos, as we said before, build bridges. So bring a modern slavery lens to developmental policies and climate policies. When it comes to NGOs, we are advocating for trainings on climate resilient activities, climate smart agriculture, and livelihood diversification. So especially development NGOs should conduct skills development workshops that prepare people to occupations in non-climate sensitive sectors, climate smart agriculture practices, and help communities to diversify their activities and plan their activities according to the season and the climatic characteristics of each period of the year. And also communities, and especially community leaders, have a role to play in this. If we think of the challenges that we outlined before, the fact that not only traffickers prey on vulnerable people in climate change affected communities, but also community members themselves, families may take harmful coping strategies that may ultimately lead to exploitation, then community leaders, taking advantage of their position of prominence and legitimacy within the community, they could create and engage in awareness raising campaigns, help people to think of ways in which to navigate the challenges of climate change without taking certain steps that may create long-term situations of exploitation. Especially we think of parents that, as we encountered in the Philippines, are putting their children in situations of child labor or even child sexual exploitation. And I'm wondering if Mustafa, since you and your colleagues at Equidem also touched on this topic, if you have something else that you would like to add on this.
Thanks, Marta. I think really what you said was really fascinating and really covered the field. I liked what you said about trying to build that awareness around climate impacts and what can be addressed around that. That's something that we're certainly seeing a lot of, is that people are very aware of the impacts, but of course they have often very little forewarning, and there's very little actual social or state support for them to address it. So, I'm minded of workers that we interviewed from the north of Pakistan that faced, historical climate-related floods a few years ago, devastating the local economy, local society. Many people died, and it led to a metaphoric flood of particularly young men leaving the region for work in the Arab Gulf region and facing significant exploitation, and it being no situation to really push against that because there was such a need by their families to address that. A few things that really came out of that, although it's anecdotal, I'd love to do more research on it, was really to your point, Marta, which is to say that firstly, an awareness in the broader community of the link between climate change and the social well-being of a community. Secondarily is around the fact that there is actually a wider international discussion around states and business and others needing to play their role to address climate impacts and also to have a just transition. And that often that the discussion that happens at the national level, in this case, Pakistan, but it's not just that country, it's across Asia, are not integrating the voices enough of people actually impacted by climate change. So that was a couple of things that came out from those communities, that there must be a link between, in this case, survivors of human trafficking, climate impacts, and their governments that are actually discussing the need for the international community to support them around climate change, but don't actually integrate them into that discussion. So, I mean, again, there's always so many other things to talk about, but that's something that really comes to mind.
Thank you so much, Mustafa, for ending to this conversation. And unfortunately, our time is up. I think time always flies when we are engaging in such interesting discussions. There are a few questions in the Q&A box that unfortunately we didn't have the time to address live in this conversation. But I would ask our panelists if they can please have a look at them and answer in the chat directly, those of them that you're positioned to answer. That would be greatly appreciated, as the audience would really benefit from your expertise on their questions. So once again, thank you, Ranjana, Ina, and Mustafa for sharing your expertise and the research work that you're doing in the Asia region. This was a really fascinating conversation, and I hand it over to Davina for the continuation of today's session.
Thank you, Marta, and a great job to everyone on the panel. Great to see so many good friends again, and excellent presentations. So now we're going to be moving into a case study on how legislative inquiries have really helped to uncover and address modern slavery. And our presenter is going to be Dr. J. de la Cruz Beckema. And she is the chief legislative officer of Senator Risa Hontiveros of the Philippines. And she's in charge of all legislative and policy interventions in her Senate office. She facilitated the passage of landmark national legislation such as expanded maternity leave law, which is incredible. I'm currently at the tail end of my own maternity leave, so really appreciate your work on that for other mothers. The mental health law, the prevention of child marriage law, and the anti-online sexual abuse and exploitation of children law. She's an award-winning legal expert. She's received an International Justice Makers Award for this work in public policy and advocacy and development lawyer. So on to you.
Thank you, Davina. Thank you for the generous introduction, and congratulations. I hope that maternity leave serves you well. So my name is Jay Beckema. I work in the office of Senator Risa Hontiveros. She's a Philippine senator and chair of the Committee on Women, Children, Family Relations, and Gender Equality. And I'm very pleased to talk about how legislative hearings, this particular vehicle, can be used to expose to the sunlight the viciousness of human trafficking, highlight the voices of victim survivors, and expose and surface possible policy gaps that where we can intervene as a legislature, as policymakers. So we have a particular interest, a long-standing interest in human trafficking and its multiple dimensions. So in 2023, we helped rescue. So I was in Maysot. We facilitated the rescue of some Filipinos who were trafficked to cyber scam hubs in Myanmar. So I'm very interested in hearing also the sharing of my co-panelists. But I'm tasked today to talk about how we use legislative investigations, in particular in two instances. The first one is the Senor Aguila case, which I will speak more about, and the other case regarding Pastor Apollo Quiboloy. So first, real quick, I'm going to talk about the legal basis of legislative investigations in the Philippines, just to give an idea of what it is. Sorry, I still want to be in the next slide, in the previous slide. Um, then I look at the case study, as I said, of Senor Aguila, then Pastor Quiboloy, and then I'd like to make some key points, mindful of the time. So next slide, thank you. So our constitution, the Philippine Constitution, says that the Senate or the House of Representatives or any of its respective committees can conduct inquiries in aid of legislation in accordance with its procedures. So the right of persons appearing in or affected by such inquiry shall be respected. So this is what is in our rules, in our statute, and it basically means that since we are in the Committee of Women and Children, we're allowed to hold hearings on issues of national interest, particular issues that we want to shine a light on. So next slide. Next in the deck. So I want to talk first about this issue of Senor Aguila. This was brought to our attention by a municipal mayor who just walked into our office and said that there was this guy who claims to be the next Jesus Christ, who claims to be the next Jesus Christ, basically. And he commands a municipality, a village of around more than 5,000 people. He recruited them after an earthquake, a particularly devastating earthquake in the province of Siargao, which is close to the south, central south of the Philippines, and told them that another earthquake would come if they don't go up the mountain and be closer to God, meaning him, no? We found out that this had devastating consequences on the village because it resulted in scores of individuals going up that mountain, leaving their jobs en masse. So police officers, lawyers, government employees, they all went up that mountain, afraid that the end of the world is nigh. But the worst part is we also uncovered grievous acts of sexual violence. So apparently this guy forced minors to get married. So it was real ceremonies were held, no? So child marriage and forcing them to engage in sexual relations with each other. So we're talking about children as young as 12 years old. And we found out that this has been going on for years without any kind of there were no sanctions, and police officers could not penetrate that area. Next slide. Next, please. So like I said, no, we found instances of child marriage. It was a practice. We also saw a pattern of child labor. They were basically made to children as young as 9 were forced to stop school, or they were given some form of education under the doctrine of that cult-like religion. They were forced to build fortresses, to do construction work, children as young as 9, 10, 11. We also found that this person had a private army with a stockpile of weapons, weapons that civilians could not access, and that he also managed to create his own quasi-state and quasi-state institutions. So he had his own Ministry of Welfare, he also was able to issue birth certificates and death certificates. So it was basically a quasi state in the middle of the remote part of the Philippines. So the next slide. So what happened there is that in that first case, we worked with law enforcement authorities, and all of them, so the guy, Senor Aguila, as he is called, and 12 of his cohorts are now currently in jail facing charges, non-bailable charges of human trafficking. So they were actually arrested. The warrants were served, the warrants of arrest for human trafficking, for our trafficking in persons law, our TIP law. It was actually served during a legislative hearing when they all came. So the second one, also making a claim that he is God, no, is one Pastor Apollo Quiboloy, so who is quite famous in the southern part of this country. He has also managed to recruit. So if the first one is a bit more small time and local, this one has achieved prominence, no, especially also because of his connections to high political figures, including the former president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte. So so we were approached by some victim survivors, witnesses, no, who claimed that of sexual abuse and sexual violence and sexual exploitation were going on inside the pastor's kingdom. So there was widespread rape of allegedly allegations of widespread rape committed by the pastor and his close ministers, allegedly against young people, against women, including some who were minors at the time the incident happened. Next slide. So yes, we saw sex trafficking, including the abuse of minors, young people. So the youngest, I think, was, but she's not our witness, but there are allegations that a girl as young as 12 was a victim. There were also foreign victim survivors, so Ukrainian women who were trafficked from Ukraine and forced to provide sexual services to this powerful pastor. We also saw instances of labor trafficking. So religious volunteers, in air quotes, no, were being forced day in and day out to beg on the streets, to work for free, basically, because they didn't have salaries, they weren't given social benefits, and there were health hazards, and they faced the hazards of the streets, no. And then we also found that there was that this basically happened because of the complicity of government officials and high government officials. So he basically leveraged the voting power of his base, no, many thousands. He claims at least 1 million people in the Philippines following him, to allow him to thrive in impunity. And we also found out here that the trafficking crosses jurisdictions, which is why that even before the Philippines took this up, because again, after the legislative hearing, it resulted in the filing of cases by the Department of Justice. There was already a warrant of arrest for sexual trafficking by the United States. So we are just waiting for the extradition treaty to be activated and a request for extradition to be served to the Philippine government. So may I go to the next? So I'd like to stay here a little because I want to discuss some of the key points that we've learned that we've also managed to reflect on in the course of our hearings. And we've been doing legislative hearings since 2016, when Senator Ontiveros won her first term. So she's on her second term now. So legislative hearings basically allow us to put front and center the voices of the victims. And the reason is that the quantum of evidence is different in legislative hearings compared to court proceedings. So we're allowed to present witnesses without the exact requirements of courts. So because also legislative hearings cannot and do not deprive persons of liberty as by way of punishment, no, only by way of contempt. So it allows us basically to present witnesses via Zoom, which we've been able to do, for instance, when we presented Ukrainian witnesses. So Ukrainian witnesses who otherwise would have been silenced in court proceedings because of the jurisdictional requirements of testimonies were allowed to speak before the Senate. Legislative hearings also leverage the power of the media and public opinion for issues that are politically contentious. So we like to call this softening the soil, no? So a very good example would be the particular case of Pastor Quiboloy, because he used to be a hot potato. So nobody wanted to touch him or touch the issue of his sexual abuse because of his perceived electoral power and his perceived influence on politicians and Philippine politics in general. But we were able to leverage the power of the media to expose his sexual abuses under the intense glare of the camera lights. And it shifted public opinion in favor of accountability, in favor of holding sexual predators to account for sexual abuses and holding human traffickers to account for cases of human trafficking. We've also found that legislative hearings assist law enforcement. So we get tips all the time, we get information that people would otherwise be unwilling to share to law enforcement authorities, because then they would have to execute an affidavit, they would have to expose themselves also, no? So basically what we do is that we tell them where to look. We say it in open hearing and there is a record and transcript of it, and it allows law enforcement agents to pursue leads that have been established in the Senate. So we also found out that these legislative hearings are very successful in highlighting the need for policy change and exposing policy gaps. No? So in the cases that I mentioned, pardon me, one important thing that surfaced is the idea of consent, no, positive consent or constructive consent in instances of rape in the context of charismatic religious organizations, because these girls, the girls that were sexually abused, some of them are not minors, so they can give or withhold consent validly. They consented, but it was out of a belief that not engaging in sexual relations with this charismatic leader would lead to eternal damnation. So is it a vitiation of consent, this gradual mental, psychological, and emotional conditioning to warrant the finding of probable cause for the case of rape? Another policy gap would be how do we characterize religious volunteers in the context of labor laws? Because the defense given is that, oh, they're volunteers, they're doing this out of service, out of a sense of religious service. But then they were made to work for 12 to 14 hours without any protections, without any wages, sometimes with even punishments if they don't remit money fast enough, no? We also, because of both cases, the Senor Aguila case and the Pastor Quiboloy case, it also gave us pause and asked us to, and we asked ourselves if there was a need to carve out specific statute or specific legislation punishing trafficking in the context of religious organizations or religious crimes in general, given the peculiar context of these kinds of organizations, which is in many cases outside the pale of law enforcement, outside public scrutiny, because they're very secretive and sometimes they're also geographically isolated. And currently, the current status is that, like I said, Senor Aguila is in jail for human trafficking. So unless the court acquits him or acquits them, no, because it's 12 of them, unless there is an acquittal, which I don't see to be forthcoming, because I think the evidence is sound, at least the evidence for child trafficking is sound because minors were involved. He will be there. They will be there for the rest of their lives. Currently, Pastor Quiboloy or Apollo Quiboloy, I do not wish to call him pastor because I know a lot of good pastors. Apollo Quiboloy is in hiding. He is currently a fugitive, and a case for anti-trafficking in persons has also been filed against him. Again, because in my belief, the legislative hearings have softened the soil, so to speak, and made the politically impossible possible. So that's it. Basically, we we like moving fast and breaking things. Our hearings and the output from our hearings speak to what these hearings can deliver, what Senate investigations can deliver in terms of centering the voices of the victims, holding perpetrators accountable, and changing policy. Thank you very much. That's all from my end.
Thank you for a truly fascinating presentation. That is quite an achievement, and I'm sorry that they're on the run at the moment, but I am sure that this does set a pretty strong deterrent for other people that are kind of manipulating social influence and public influence to further exploit people. So thank you very much. That was an excellent, excellent presentation. So now our next presentation is Cyber Slavery, the Dark Side of Digital Platforms, where Mina Chiang, the founder and director of Humanity Research Consultancy, will discuss the growing issue of cyber slavery, where individuals are exploited through digital platforms, and identify the challenges and potential solutions to these threats. And she is based in the United Kingdom and has had a lot of expertise consulting on this for governments, NGOs, and has done a lot of work in Southeast Asia in the fishing industry and around survivor engagement and empowerment. We are very much looking forward to hearing about your work. Thank you, Mina.
Thank you so much, Davina. Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, everybody. And I will just straight go into the presentation. So I guess by now, most of us have heard about the concept of cyber slavery. It's basically when someone is being forced to go into scamming compound in kind of a location like this. What they are being forced to do is not like traditional type of exploitation, but rather they are being forced to perform an illegal activity, which is scam or fraud. So there's actually a kind of a double crime, like behind the screen is a person being exploited, but the other side of the screen is somebody losing money to the criminal. For example, in this picture, we can see that from the sky, it has multiple buildings, it has dormitory and offices, you even have KTV and restaurant and multiple different functions. Similarly to other compounds that we can see from the sky, that it's actually expanding quite quickly and fast. If you look at it through multiple years, 2022, you might see they occupy this space around a river, but now 2024, you are seeing it expanding to 3 times larger. It's all very much worrying and very much the kind of showing how this problem is still on the rise. Scamming compound exists in multiple countries, including the previous two slides I showed, which is in Cambodia and Myanmar. But it's beyond that. You can also find it, for example, here in Dubai. Recently, there were just some raids, so you can see the profile of people who are in the compound are actually from all over the world, particularly from South Asia in this context. You can also find scamming compound in locations, for example, like Philippines and Laos, and it's actually people identify more and more in different countries. So throughout the world, every time when we realize there's scamming compounds, we see the similar kind of a structure. On top, we see local authority. So this could be a very high level local authority in the country, or could be just the local police station that's willing to receive bribe and willing to provide impunity to the criminal activities. So in a sense, they are on the payroll of the criminal. Then we have these compound owners, which in a sense, a bit like landlord. So they are the one who actually create and develop those buildings and able to provide the offices and accommodation. Then you might have different tenants. So the tenants are the individual different gangsters and groups and mafias. So for example, you might have Office One that's running pig butchering scam that's targeting Americans, and you have the other office that's focusing on sport gambling scam. The other office focus on extortion towards Indians, for example. So you might have multiple tenants. They are paying the monthly dues to the criminal owner of the land. Then you might have the compound manager who's actually in charge of all the quite brutal type of management. And in this case of a scamming compound, unfortunately, what we realize is that it tends to be really quite brutal. We see pictures and videos of people being severely tortured. The case of a death, it's quite regular to hear. And also, for example, because you have that compound manager, then whereas the workers, you have the employee or the scammers that's coming to under the management. And how do you source those people? If you cannot find the willing criminals, then this is the time that actually criminals trying to go for unwilling criminals, in the sense that to go through human trafficking to stuff their work. You will always find money launderings because there's a large amount of money that we're talking about here. So just to give a bit more flavor how it actually feels like. So this is an ethical hacker hack into the computer of the scammer. Then you will see there's this tool called Hello World. It allows you to open multiple social medias at the same time. So you might have multiple WhatsApp account, multiple Telegram account, and in every account, you might have multiple people that you are chatting at the moment. You will say, look, honey, how are you these days? Oh yeah, my darling, do you want to go investment together with me? You can also see a built-in translation function here. So it can help you to translate, for example, you input Chinese, output Spanish, or you input English, output German. That helps the scammers to actually be able to scale the manufacture that kind of a scam. So the problem we are talking about here, it's quite huge and major. So in terms of the number, the UN, the ODC report is saying that the one of the countries in Southeast Asia is losing around half of its GDP to this type of criminal activities. And also the Interpol, also several months ago, saying that human trafficking and cyber scam centers have already expanded into a global network, making up $3 trillion a year. And this is a shocking number, because if you compare with any other estimations of other kind of crime, we never see this kind of a scale of $3 trillion. A lot of the time it's in 100 billion level. So it is just showing like how massive this issue is, and it can be sometimes even out of our comprehension. And it's still very new, so we are still learning day by day, like the more detail of how it operates. So we also realize that there's this very sophisticated global supply chain. So that means not necessarily one criminal group is in charge of all the activities, but you might find different quote unquote suppliers that's supplying different activities to each other. So for example, there will be groups that specialize in personal data scrubbing. So they may be providing a list of American citizens' phone number, or you might have groups that's specializing in building fake websites, so different kind of crypto trading platforms. Then you might have different teams that's in terms of script writing. How can you write a better story that more convincing, that more victims can fall into your trick? There's also, of course, in our concern, like the human trafficking groups, and the human trafficking group can be in country. They could be based in Ethiopia, based in Kenya, but like trafficking people all the way from Kenya to Myanmar, for example. There's also, for example, the coding, tech improvement people. I've met some survivors myself and who were saying like they were not actually doing scam, but then they were forced to improve the technology, the coding of the company. So it's quite shocking in how sophisticated it is. You can think about it almost like a car supply chain or like computer supply chain. You have people harvesting the metals and all the way to assembling line. So the worker profile that we realize is also quite complicated. Like, of course, if you're talking about a traditional type of criminal activity, you have willing fraudsters that they are just happy to be a fraudster and then stay in the compound as a fraudster. But you also, of course, when we started like really in touch with this issue, we realized a lot of people they thought this is a secretary job. They thought this is a kind of any other kind of a job, but then they were just being forced to do scam and stayed as indentured servitude or forced labor. However, we also gradually realized even people who entered as a criminal, they might also face a situation that when they want to leave, they were not able to, so they stayed as indentured servitude, or vice versa. For people who initially like entered as a victim, then they realize there's no chance for them to leave because local authorities not helping and NGOs it's having difficulties to bring them out, and then just kind of become this concept of an alpha victim that they kind of comply with what's going on in the criminal compound. So for example, my team and I, we have investigated a lot of Telegram groups, and you can see in those Telegram groups, there are many channels that talks about dumping people. So what does it mean, dumping people? This is basically buy and sell human beings. So they might have a text saying, "Oh yeah, I have several people here in Philippines, in said, and anybody who's interested in purchasing land, contact me." So this is the kind of dynamic of this type of channels that we're seeing trafficking being like discussed in a very open way by criminals themselves. And also you can see the syndicates sometimes searching for different expertise. So they may actually be directly saying, "Oh yeah, we are searching for somebody who can speak Korean or Russian or Vietnamese." What does it mean? It means they are trying to scam Koreans and Russian and Vietnamese, and they want people who can speak the language. They will also mention, for example, accommodation and the location in it. So, for example, in the middle one here, it says the locations in Laos, special economic zones, which is a very well-known scamming compound area. And sometimes you might also find some criminals that themselves accepting some very problematic conditions. So for example, here, I just want to bring your attention to here, like this person is saying, "I'm searching for a job myself, and I accept confinement." So they are basically saying they are okay to lose their freedom, maybe for 6 months or for 1 year, and they know what they are doing. They know that this is a place searching for scam operation, scam jobs. And I just want to also expand a little bit that not just people who being forced to work as scammers are victims. Actually, the victim type we realize is much wider than that. So for example, there could be victims who being forced to work as a video models, and we realize several, for example, victims from Central America very often being forced to act as models. Then there's, of course, always sex trafficking around the compound, unfortunately, and it's very difficult to even identify them because they cannot even access phones and computers. Then there are also people being forced to act as security guards. There may be multiple security guards on the floor, around the wall, around the compound, and people being forced to act as agents. So the ones in charge of buying expensive bags and cars for the compound owners. So I want to talk also a little bit about the kind of solution and the government activity part. So a lot of the time, the problem is when we see people being rescued or escape from a scamming compound, because they were forced to act as a scammer, and therefore the authorities may not even have a proper system in filtering them or like identifying them as potential victims, but rather a lot of the time they're just being straight away treated as criminals, or for example, people who illegally break the border rules are just sent to the detention center. But I want to emphasize that the UN High Commission for Human Rights and recommended principles emphasize that trafficking victims should not be detained, charged, or prosecuted for the illegal activities of their entry into the residence countries of transit destination, and also should not be charged for their involvement in unlawful activities. So in short, this is the concept of non-punishment principle. But still, at the moment, we are seeing many countries are not really taking this into account carefully, but rather a lot of the time, hundreds of people just being sent to detention centers or jails without potentially recognizing they can be victims of human trafficking. So a little bit about like what HRC we are doing. So for example, we realize this is such a global issue that there's no single country alone can solve the problem, because we might be saying like the kingpins from country A, and then the victims of forced labor come from country B, can be actually 100 plus different countries. And then the operation side located in country C, and scammers scam the victims in country E. So I'm just trying to illustrate how diverse and how interconnected this issue is. No single country can address it. And therefore, HRC, for example, right now, we are trying very hard to go through the route of UNTOC. So this is United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. That's how we define, for example, human trafficking or migrant smuggling. But then at the moment, organized cyber fraud is not being defined as a serious crime or transnational organized crime. But we think there's a need to make sure that the whole will recognize the importance and difficulties of this issue. So a bit about like the solutions. I guess maybe you have heard about the issue. If not, I'm really glad that today you got to know about the issue. But as I mentioned, we are still in a very early stage of this crime. So for example, if I talk about, let's say, chocolate and child labor, yes, everybody has heard about that because that issue has existed for decades. But when it comes to scam and human trafficking, cyber slavery, it's so new that many people still struggle to comprehend. And if we don't even have the awareness, it's really hard to convince the government to spend budget to make sure they allocate personnel to address the issue. So I would say today, if you are here, try as much as you can to learn about the issue, and also try as much as you can to think about your positionality. If you are government officials, if you are NGOs, what can you do to address and to support in like really helping to stop this criminal activity? Thank you so much, everybody, and welcome to reach out. I'm very happy to hear any feedbacks, any questions. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Mina. That was an excellent presentation. So now we're going to go to a Q&A portion. I believe both of our speakers from our last two panels, that'll be Mina and Jay, will be responding to questions that have been sent to them, and as also that may be in the Q&A feed.
Meena, so there is a question for you in the chat section from Abigail. She says that what role do tech companies play in preventing cyber slavery practices?
Right, to completely prevent, I would say to address the criminals. So today I didn't talk that much about, for example, the criminal profile, but yes, many of them are actually very much explicit about what they are doing, which is, I guess, connecting to what Jay was talking about. Like, they might, for example, having that special economic zone that they are running, that they are the king in that small little kingdom. So a lot of the time right now, even though, for example, they are sanctioned by the US or by the UK, but nobody can actually touch them yet. So I would say like addressing the criminal network is the first and the most important root cause. So I hear many people sometimes say we need to raise awareness and try to make sure people don't be trafficked to the scamming compound. But for me, that's not enough. That's only half of a solution, because our world has 7 billion people. You can always find more vulnerable people or people who have never heard about the issue be trafficked. The most important thing is to really stop the criminal and making sure we have accountabilities. If they need to go to jail, they should go. If they need to be sanctioned, they should be limited. There should be ways to actually be creative in finding ways to limit the criminal activities. That for me will be the most important to stop it. Again, like this is something I didn't necessarily share publicly, but there are many different groups at the moment trying very hard to identify who are the criminal network and trying to, be sending that information to the law enforcement, to Interpol, and have it works in the background. So thank you so much for the question.
Do you mind if I speak to this issue a little, just to add to the point made by Mina? And I, because I absolutely agree that raising awareness and telling people they shouldn't be trafficked is just maybe 1/3 of the equation, and really have to crack down on these syndicates. So we've also been doing our own investigations on the cyber scam hubs. And recently, our president, announced that offshore gambling outfits, so we call them POGO, would be banned. And then from our sources, because we also have contacts who work within these companies, we've learned that they're packing up and going to Cambodia. So unless we do something drastic and really choke these syndicates, and these are transnational syndicates, we will only see an uptick of outbound migration from the outbound trafficking from the Philippines to Cambodia. They will just transfer their illegal businesses there, where the climate is more hospitable. So we really need to and urgently have a regional response to these criminal syndicates. Yeah, sorry, Mina, for jumping in.
No, this is great. Thank you for the comments.
So we have another question addressed to you both, which is, Jay, for your presentation, people really are appreciating a lot your presentation. It was quite an eye-opener, and Meena too. So the question addressed to both of you is, how did enslaved people resist and challenge their conditions, both individually and collectively? The scenario which Jay described, and then the scenario which Mina described, in which people are scammed. So in both scenarios, what was a collective action around that? So please answer in brief. The time is short. Yeah.
In the situations, in the context that I presented, our hearings were really driven and propelled by victim survivors coming out and saying, "Look, I've had enough. This is what happened, and we'll give you information." And I also know that our victim survivors are in contact with law enforcement agents to help fugitives. So we are really putting their voices front and center. We are giving them space, holding space for them, and they are helping law enforcement and helping move the case forward.
Yeah, the survivors we are seeing, or victims who are still being exploited, they might do a few things. So, for example, they might try very hard to identify other people who also want to escape and trying to plan work together. So, for example, in the last several months, you might also see groups and groups of Indians trying to come out from compounds in Cambodia that was making quite a lot of news. For example, sometimes we also see victims in their trafficking situation. They try to collect intelligence that the information of the criminal so that they can use that afterwards, or even still when they are in danger, which is really remarkable and very, very brave of them. Sometimes once they come out, they also are very determined to try to stop this issue. So they become really the frontline fighters in stopping the scamming compound and really to utilize whatever skills and knowledge they have to collaborate with law enforcement. So it's really quite remarkable, all the strengths and all the resistance that even despite the pressures and difficulties they are in. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. We have more than 10 questions for you, Meena and Jay, in the Q&A section. With the shortage of time, we are not able to take it live now, but please feel free to go through the Q&A session and type your answers to those questions. Thank you very much. Over to you, Davina.
Great, thank you for that. That was an excellent Q&A, and like they mentioned, we will be able to respond to more of those in the chat. So now we are on to our transparency and accountability panel on responsible behavior in global supply chains and workers' voices, where we're exploring strategies for promoting transparency and accountability in the supply chains and discussing methods to ensure that products are not produced with exploitative practices. And moderating this panel is my great friend, Brian. I'm so excited to introduce him. He's actually one of the creative geniuses behind the movement narrative. So as a note, that's also in the chat to look into. He's a creative genius, and we're so lucky to have him as the head of communications and digital engagement here with Free the Slaves. Before that, he ran his own creative agency specializing in strategic communication and media productions for NGOs in Asia. And he's worked on messaging and content related to child vulnerability, anti-trafficking, HIV and AIDS, refugees, agriculture, poverty alleviation, community development, and education. Very impressively, he's also currently pursuing a PhD in peace building at Payap University in Chiang Mai, Thailand. And he is exploring the role of rhetoric and discourse in shaping peace and conflict in humanitarian, human rights, governance, and emerging technology sectors. So Brian, with that, over to you.
Thank you, Davina, for that kind introduction. I'm grateful to be with all of you today. And I'd like to start with the introductions of our wonderful panel this afternoon. We have three eminent experts from the Asia region that we're going to discuss a variety of topics. But I wanted to just start with their introductions. So without further ado, I'll let them introduce themselves. Let's start with Yogita. You have 5 minutes to introduce yourself. Please take the floor.
Hello, everyone. Hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I'm Yogita Bajacharya. I work in national business initiatives, and it's been almost 10 years that I've been working in private sector engagement, and it's been 5 years that I have been working in private sector engagement, particularly focusing on countering trafficking in person, and I have been engaged in providing technical leaderships for the activities related to private sector engagement in promotion of responsible business practices. And talking about national business initiatives, it is the organization established by 14 major Nepalese business associations, and we also have individual companies, and it established as a political organization in 2005. And NBI seeks to strengthen the role and capacity of Nepalese private sector in to contribute in sustainable peace in Nepal. Our main motto is there can be no successful business without a successful society, and there can be no successful society without a successful business. So we have been engaging private sector in overall development of the overall society, and we do so by mobilizing the existing private sector bodies at the local and higher levels, generating new knowledge relating to private sector on softer issues around peace, conflict, and development, and creating demand as well as support for the positive change in the society. Our vision is for the sustainable peace in Nepal through responsible socio-economic growth, and we lead the responsible business movement for peaceful and prosperous Nepal. So some of the thematic areas that NBI has been engaged in and that we have been working on engaging the private sector is peace, security, and rule of law, responsible and sustainable business, and innovation and entrepreneurship. So that is the brief introduction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yogita. I'm going to now turn to Jen. Jen, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, yes, thanks, Brian. So yes, hi everyone. I'm Jen Green. I'm Vice President for Partnerships and Advisory at Labor Solutions. I'm based in Jakarta, Indonesia. Labor Solutions is a tech company that kind of works within the employer-employee relationship to ensure that workers in global supply chains know their rights and have access to ways to exercise their rights. And we do that, through a variety of tools and by connecting workers and their employers to the rest of the supply chain and to the rest of the ecosystem that's built to protect workers. We're very kind of engaged. We work with over 70 brands, and 2.5 million workers are active on our app today. And so we're really excited to kind of talk about how technology, particularly, but in general, how we can use accountability and transparency to improve workers' abilities to protect themselves and to access resources to be free of modern slavery.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that great introduction. And last but not least, Matt, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. I had a chance to look at the names of the people who are participants. There's a lot of people who kind of go back to 20 years ago that I knew them, and it's great to see their names. I've been working on this issue for about 35 years. I spent 17 years with USAID, posted in Nepal for 8 years, 5 years in Bangladesh, and 3 years in Thailand related to USAID, and then basically worked with the United Nations for 6 years, ran a large interagency project there. As part of that process, we came to realize that there's a lot of people disenfranchised. The present number that everyone is using now is about 50 million. Out of the 50 million, 27 million would be forced labor. But as it relates to this topic, 82% of that would be associated with the private sector. So we're really talking about a lot of people that are associated with the private sector, and as a result of that, we have to be working with them. Another kind of interesting statistic is, according to the Trafficking in Persons report, about 130,000 people were identified as being helped last year out of modern slavery. That means that out of 50 million people, you have about 0.2% that are documented as being helped, less than 1%. So we really need to be identifying those groups we can work with in order to make a difference. And so my organization, the Mekong Club, works with the private sector. We are based in Hong Kong, and we have an approach where we work with the private sector in a positive, supportive, non-naming and shaming way. And how we do this is with an association model. We have an association that has about 60 companies associated with us. This includes banks, manufacturers, retailers, the hospitality sector. And we work with these organizations to help them to understand the issue of human trafficking, what they need to do, how to protect their business, and so forth. This particular group meets on a quarterly basis. So the respective working groups or sectors meet, and when they meet, they debate and discuss and identify what they feel is needed in order to address the issue. Based on that, they make suggestions to us, the Mekong Club, to develop trainings or tools or apps or whatever is needed in order to address the problem. We also have a baseline that we use when a company is onboarded to identify where a particular company is in their journey in addressing modern slavery. That baseline allows us to get a general sense of, are they raising awareness? Are they getting their leadership to understand the issue? Do they have risk assessment? Do they get into the supply chains? What are they doing? How are they doing it? Do they have grievance mechanisms? And based on that, if they don't have it, we help them to put these things in place. In addition to that, we provide a lot of training and consultation. If a company finds itself in a situation where they do an audit and they find modern slavery associated with it, we'll sit down with their legal people, sit down with their compliance people, and then work to do whatever is needed in order to address the issue. Another area that we're spending a lot more time on is working with suppliers, the factories themselves. A lot of the factories basically have these requirements not to have ILO indicators of modern slavery associated with them. But as a result of not really having education related to this, they don't really know what to do. And so what we're really trying to do in their language is provide training and so forth. So much of what we're really trying to do is to offer kind of an opportunity to work with the private sector in a positive way, to help them to understand that there are organizations like us that have the expertise and the understanding and the experience in order to give them the tools and the information, the knowledge they need. And then if they run into an issue, we basically help them. The last thing I'll say is that a lot of people feel like it's really the NGOs, the United Nations, and the governments that are doing the work to address modern slavery. But within a lot of large corporations, you have risk assessment officers, you have compliance officers. These are people who do work like the NGOs, but within the companies. And what they basically do is to try to ensure that their supply chains, all the way down to the lowest level, are transparent, and there's accountability associated with it, which allows for them basically to protect their business. So by protecting the business to ensure there's no exploitation, at the same time, they're also protecting workers in supply chains as well. With that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matt, for that concise introduction and for the background on how you guys engage with businesses. That's very helpful. As you'll see from, I guess, as you've heard from the different introductions today, each of our panelists has a different area of expertise. And so I've kind of narrowed our topics down into three ideas: inclusion of workers, the challenges that businesses face, and then how do we advocate for transparency in supply chains in constructive ways. So I have questions that I've sent to the panelists ahead of time, but we're going to try and work through these as fast as we can and see how much ground we can cover in the next 25 minutes. So I'm going to go back and start with you, Geeta. My first question for you is, given your experience leading a network of businesses, I'm wondering if you can share with us how business networks like yours and other similar organizations, like the Chamber of Commerce, can promote and enforce transparency and accountability regarding exploitive labor practices among their members. Additionally, how can civil society provide support for these organizations and networks as they work on these initiatives?
Okay, Brian, according to our experience, these organizations play a lead role in promoting and enforcing transparency and accountability regarding exploitative labor practices among their members. There are several ways in which business associations like Chamber of Commerce and other business associations can support, like they can facilitate collective actions where companies join forces to commit to behave ethically and responsibly, which is possible by these kind of organizations. And they represent these organizations represent the interest of the businesses and provide a platform for the discussion of the relevant issues. And not only that, but when the relevant issues are discussed there, they can also provide the solution, like how they can engage in eradicating these kind of modern slavery in the overall supply chain and promote responsible business practices. And in many cases, we can see that most of the companies are motivated when to take the certain actions like ending modern slavery when their competitors are doing so. So in that case, these kind of associations are very effective, and they have indeed played an important role in setting integrity and responsible business standards, mainly through the adoption of the code of conducts. And we NBI also have developed this business code of conduct concepts, and more than 100 businesses have adopted it, and which includes the code of conducts related to labor management, consumer rights, and taxation and all. These code of conducts plays an important role in it. And also, as shared earlier, these associations provides training facilities related to how these code of conducts can be applied to their organizations. And we have also developed these tools related to how the responsible business practices can be applied to the businesses, and provide training to them, make the risk assessment process and all, and identify the loopholes which are very risky area for this modern slavery. And we can identify through the risk assessment that where these exploitations are high in the overall value supply chain. So these kind of trainings we provide, and through these associations we reach out to the private sectors and provide them for the platform of gaining the knowledge and sharing. And also they suggest us what kind of tools will be more effective, and according to the nature of the business, as our organization have business members from the multiple sector, like hospitality sector, there are MSMEs, there are trading, manufacturing sectors. But however, to date, the majority of the collective action approaches have been promoted by CSOs, who have been playing an instrumental role in bringing together the private and public sectors, particularly in the developing countries, which has also been shown by the Transparency International in the study report 2010. And while the support of the CSOs is seen as an instrumental and important to bring more credibility in the process, business associations could play a bigger role when it comes to mobilizing the companies to collectively fight against modern slavery. And as I said earlier, NBI believes that there can be no successful business without successful society. So we have been promoting ethical and responsible business practices since its inception, and we have formed this Responsible Business Alliance Nepal network, which is a structured network of progressive businesses, and they have come together to promote and build joint initiatives with advanced social objectives, as well as business development goals. And it is an informal, high-level strategic alliance of businesses to enhance sensitivity and engagement, aimed at promoting responsible and sustainable business practices among companies operating in Nepal. And we provide trainings, awareness raising. For recently, we have provided awareness.
Yogita, I'll give you a 1-minute warning, please.
Programs to the businesses of majorly affected area from this trafficking, the role of the private sectors in combating trafficking in person, and what they can do, how they can engage, and also generated a commitment to act on it. And we have been expanding our RBN network throughout the country, and also develop this responsible business toolkit and providing trainings on it. So as you have said, so these business associations are very important for these kind of for promoting this transparency and accountability regarding exploitative labor practices. And it will be more effective if they work collaboratively like with the CSOs, like the organization NBI. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Now we're going to turn to Jen. As an organization focused on worker-centered engagement, can you describe worker-centered engagement as it relates to transparency in supply chains? I'm particularly interested in the effects of identifying exploitation in supply chains, where issues can lead to canceled contracts that force businesses to close and result in increased vulnerability of workers. So how do we engage this transparency and accountability process well from a worker-centered perspective that protects workers and not just companies' reputations?
Great, absolutely. Thanks, Brian. So yes, I think, and as the other speakers have been kind of saying, there are many layers of protection kind of in this ecosystem that we're working in, right? So we have kind of workers themselves and their knowledge of their rights and ability to access remedies. We have, workplaces and employers. We have brands and industry associations. We have trade unions. We have governments. And then we have, kind of other kind of larger UN organizations and other types of large initiatives. And so what we kind of have here is a lot of different relationships that workers can look to for, that support that they need. The kind of tact that Labor Solutions took as a company was to say, look, a lot of these, audits, trade unions, brands, MSIs, are trying to kind of gather a lot of information from workers, but actually the workers' primary relationship is with their employer. So let's see how we can strengthen that relationship and push it towards responsible business practices so that that kind of becomes the hub around which we can reinforce good practices and collect data to help both workers know when things are not going well in their workplace and to help employers understand how to respect workers' rights. I think that there's, especially now where there's a lot of new legislation, a lot of standards, a lot of different types of audits and checklists and codes of conduct. And I think, these are all really important tools that we have. But I think that, the tenor of the market is really, one of a lot of chasing kind of these new standards and not, kind of sitting back and saying, okay, how do we build something sustainable that will ensure that workers are protected? And so in terms of, accountability and transparency, I think, we need to kind of think of workers, from their perspective and engage workers in a participatory way and say, what is most helpful to you? And I think what's most helpful to workers is understanding their rights and what their rights should look like in a workplace, how that, practically manifests itself. Do workers have a copy of their contract? Do they understand how their pay is calculated? Do they know kind of where their debts are coming from? If they have debts related to kind of gaining employment, do they know who those debts are owed to and why? And often, especially when we're talking about vulnerable populations, whether that's internal or kind of international migrants, there's a lot of different actors that get involved. And the reason it's so difficult to unravel is because, it's not just one recruitment agent that a worker will talk to, it's 5 recruitment agents. And it's only the kind of final one that talks to the company and that talks to the brand. And that is really kind of vetted and checked, but actually there's so many other, kind of actors along the way that without workers knowing, how they should interact and what they should expect, that there's really, it's very difficult to actually kind of prevent a lot of this harm. So, I mean, we, as a company kind of take the role of making sure that employers who want to, kind of be up to speed on the best practices have that information. So we distill international regulations and standards, as well as, kind of regional and local, into kind of easier to understand small checklists, toolkits, and online learnings for corporate managers and also for workers. We also work with great organizations like Mekong Club and Just Good Work. Just Good Work is a nonprofit that has an app that helps workers before they even leave their home country to be recruited, to understand through video and through conversations with current workers what their new workplace might look like, what their accommodations will be like, what their pay will be, their take-home pay and not just their contract amount. And be able to explain that to their friends and family, which I think is also a really critical part. We have these support networks kind of in our home countries and in our communities. And one of the dangers, one of the reasons that migrant workers are so vulnerable is the loss of those support networks when they move somewhere new to take a job and they don't have someone that they trust in order to ask questions, to verify that the way that the terms that they're getting are reasonable, and things like that. And so, building back these networks through technology is a really easy way that we can, kind of support workers to say, I'm not sure that I'm comfortable with this, what is everyone else's terms? I didn't get paid on time. Is that going to be, you know, the standard? You know, what is my next, you know, kind of pay period? And when will I, you know, get that promotion or possibility of promotion that I was promised? All of these types of things. And so I think, you know, there's a role for all of these actors. And I think an active role is required in all of these spaces to make sure that we're reaching out proactively and making sure
I'm going
that
to give you a 1 minute warning, Jen.
yeah, great. That, yeah, we need to make sure that workplaces are safe and that workers have, you know, both a way to keep their employers accountable, but also, you know, have government resources, have CSOs, have other trade unions and other protections so that they can go outside and find answers to the questions that they need and find the resources and support. So yeah, I'll stop there for now. Thanks.
Excellent. That's a very comprehensive answer. Thank you so much. I'm going to move quickly to Matt here. Matt, I appreciated what you said in your introduction about engaging businesses in a non-combative, non-shaming way. And so I wanted to kind of continue on with that. How do we, as a civil society community, as a movement against modern slavery, how do we advocate for transparency and accountability in ways that improve opportunities for collaboration and foster deeper, more respectful relationships between stakeholders, and avoid oversimplifying the issue and also casting blame or assuming ill intent on the part of different stakeholders?
Great question. Well, you know, when you stop and look at the private sector, there's different levels. They're the brands, the big companies that you see when you go to the malls, their names and so forth. And then those organizations have factories that they work with. Tier 1 would be where they assemble all of the items, and then Tier 2 is where the component parts come, and Tier 3 is basically where you have the raw materials. And so these supply chains are quite complex. And so when it comes to the brands, most of the major brands have the resources to be able to get the technical assistance to understand what they need to do in order to address modern slavery. But when it comes to the next level, the factories and the sub-factories and the sub-sub-factories, oftentimes they are held accountable for the ILO indicators of modern slavery and for audit regulations and so forth, but many of them don't really understand what it is that they're supposed to do. And so, for example, I was in Malaysia, I walked into a factory office and the manager had all the passports on the desk. And I said, "You can't have those passports. Why do you have them?" And he said, "Well, if I give it to the employees, they'll all run away." And I said, "That's exactly the reason why you can't have them." And he said, "Oh, well, that's kind of a Western thing. It's being kind of imposed from the West to the East. We do things differently here." And then I said, "Well, I heard that some of the employees were being slapped on the top of their head for basically, you know, not working fast enough." "Oh, come on, you know, that's a situation where, you know, for the most part, you know, we've been doing it this way for years. When I was 15 years old working in a factory, that's happened." So I had to sit down with this guy and have a conversation. And what I came to realize is that he really didn't understand what it was required in order to address the issue of modern slavery. He kind of knew, but he was afraid to ask questions because the moment he did that, he would out the fact that he didn't know much about this. So much of what I think is needed is for us not to wag a finger at the factories and say you're terrible, is to find a way of engaging with them, to sit down with them, to figure out what they know, what they don't know, and then offer training and awareness raising and say to them, you know, a grievance mechanism isn't punitive. It's an opportunity for you to understand what it is that you need to know in a particular situation to improve your factory. It's a positive thing. So there is this kind of animosity that often exists between the private sector and the NGO world. Let's face it, it exists. And it's partly because the private sector doesn't understand and trust the NGO sector and vice versa. And the reason for that is that there's a fair amount of naming and shaming of companies. Now, to a certain extent, when a company is complicit with things that are bad and they're doing the wrong thing, they need to be called out. So naming, shaming has a place. But if you don't have organizations that can work with the private sector, that has a trusting relationship with the private sector, you can't have that relationship. And if you think that you're going to wag your finger and say something about the private sector and then go to them and say, we would like to help you, it'll never happen. So in our world, the Mekong Club, we work on the positive side. We accept the fact that companies do things and they do things wrong, but we also try to help them to understand the rationale and the reason for doing these things, because by them protecting their business, it'll ensure that they get more business. And by doing that at the same time, they're protecting workers. And so what we're really trying to do is to say it's a win-win. You protect your business, you protect the workers, everyone's happy, and you're in compliance with what you need to be. So the bottom line I'm trying to say here is that we have to make sure that we have access to the factories and the sub-factories. We have to try to develop a sense of trust. And by that, we would be able to retool them, educate them, and make them better able to understand what they need to do to be in compliance with the organizations they work with.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was an excellent, concise answer. So we have, by my clock, 8 minutes. So we're going to go to, I have one more question for each of you, but this is going to have to be a speed round. So 2-minute answers. I'll start with Yogita first. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges that businesses in Nepal are facing as they attempt to eliminate exploitation from their supply chains and from their workplaces? 2 minutes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the question again. So the major challenges that the businesses of Nepal face here is, Matt said, shared earlier, it is the lack of acknowledgement. Like these private businesses do not know that they do not have the rationale of doing these things, that they do not know what they have been actually doing, and they are the exploitation that they contribute directly, indirectly. So that is the major problem that has been creating. And also more than 50% of the businesses comes from informal sector, and there is no proper regulatory body that which can be which can be formalized, and which are need to be punished for doing their business correctly and eliminating these kind of activities. And also not only that, more than 95% of MSMEs, there are more than 95% of businesses are MSMEs, and they are having the problem to survive their business. So they do not take
30 seconds.
So they do not take these as the important issues. So the problem starts from the lack of acknowledgement. And also we can take the example of the RBN members that we have. Like even they try to apply the responsible business practices tool in their organization by developing their policies, like implementing their proper procurement policies and all. They are not being able to implement it because lower the line, the suppliers which provide their raw materials, that they cannot maintain it. So these are the problem that the businesses in Nepal are facing. But slowly organization
Sorry,
like
time's up.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, over to Jen. We've got 5 minutes left. Jen, how can we include, with survivor engagement being a significant portion of the movement narrative that's happening right now, how can we include workers at risk and exploited workers in transparency and accountability efforts? 2 minutes.
Thanks. Yes. So I think, first of all, I think we need to make sure that we're listening to workers. There's, I think, a lot of movement towards big data and, kind of AI and these things to kind of predict and prevent. And I think that that has a place. But I think we also need workers to actually speak for themselves when talking about their workplaces and their experience. So I think that's critical. Two is, yeah, I think, that we have to involve workers in remedy and prevention. They know kind of their situation and the pitfalls and challenges that they face in, kind of finding decent work and having those protections that they need. And so, yeah, absolutely, rights holders, as well as other, kind of organizations need to be involved in prevention and remedy. And I think technology is a great tool here for making sure that these processes are trauma informed, right? Because revisiting traumatic experiences, not being anonymous, types of things can be really, really make it really, really difficult for survivors and people who have experienced forced labor to share their experiences. And so with technology, we can have ways where, yeah, people who have been impacted by forced labor, can share their experiences and contribute
30
to
seconds.
better processes and better protections for workers, without kind of re-traumatizing themselves. So that's it. I think education, involvement of workers, and yeah, prevention and remedy. That's it from me.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jen. Matt, final question here. Maybe a bit of a sensitive one, but given your depth of experience over the last 35 years, I thought it would be appropriate for you. We talk a lot about supply chains in big businesses. We're moving towards supply chain issues in small and medium enterprises. But as NGOs, as CSOs, we also have supply chains. Social enterprises have supply chains that fall well below the radar of a lot of these regulations. How should we look at our own obligations regarding supply chain transparency?
We have to walk the talk. There are some rather large NGOs that are addressing this issue, and I've approached them and had a conversation and said, you guys keep saying this is what needs to be done. How many items do you procure yourself? 300. How many of those items are big enough for you to feel like you need to ensure that, in fact, you're in compliance yourself? And most NGOs don't have a response to that because they don't feel it's an obligation. But at the end of the day, what we're really facing in this kind of movement within trying to ensure that there's no exploitation in supply chains is that everybody, the brands, the suppliers, the sub-suppliers, the NGOs, the United Nations, the governments, all look at their own supply chains and do the same thing. It's not just about the private sector. So if you're a large organization and you're out there and doing the good work of helping to raise human rights and human trafficking prevention and so forth, but you're not walking the talk, if you're not looking at your own supply chains, then you yourself are not you're being almost disingenuous when it comes to this topic. What you can do is to identify what suppliers you have, identify which of them are large enough that you feel like you need to have some type of an intervention. And for the ones that are in risky locations that perhaps are selling things that could be tainted, maybe you need to do an audit. Maybe you need to call them up and have a conversation. Maybe you need to have some type of a survey. But what you really need to do as part of this process is to hold yourself accountable to the same things that you're expecting other organizations to do. And by doing that, you're demonstrating that you're modeling what your recommendations are. And that's a good thing for us to be doing.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I was hoping that you would address it well, and that was a fantastic response to close our panel. Thank you so much. I think we don't have any questions from the audience that will fit within the allotted time frame. So I'm going to yield the floor back to Davina. Again, thank you so much for each of you for your contributions. I really appreciate you guys sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you all. That was great. My goodness, Brian, that was expertly helmed. I couldn't believe the countdown was incredible. That was great. Thank you. So now we're moving on to our next presentation on promoting CSO capacities to provide data for human rights due diligence initiatives and supply chains with Sarah Lintz of Verite. So this is a great speaker to kind of follow on the presentations we've had. She's had an interesting background. She's worked as a roofer, a carpenter, a brick mason, and also as a researcher, teacher, pickle maker, and academic. And for the last 10 years, she's been working with civil society, governments, and the private sector to eliminate exploitation of migrant workers in global supply chains. So, Sarah, thank you for one of the most interesting bios I think I've seen for any of the forums. And over to you.
Great, thank you, Davina. I'm gonna start by sharing my screen. So let's just take the technology bit for a second here. All right. Are you seeing my screen and you're hearing me?
Yes, Sarah.
Yes, okay, thank you. So I am humbled to be part of this forum. I am grateful to the previous speakers and all of their depth of knowledge. I hope what I have to share about the FACT project just builds on the conversation for this amazing session. I'm going to talk about the FACT project and hang on one second. The power of worker-centric data to address debt bondage, which is a type of exploitation that many migrant workers face. I'm trying to advance my screen. Let's see if I can do that. Apologies. Okay, there we go. So the project was spearheaded by Verite, the organization that I work with. This is a global nonprofit that builds knowledge and tools to address the most serious labor and human rights abuses in global supply chains. It has been my incredible honor to be involved in this project with more than 7 other civil society and workers organizations across 4 countries. So in India, Bangladesh, and Malaysia, we've partnered with organizations such as Sheva, BOMSA, Warby Development Foundation, MSEMVS, Free the Slaves, and Dignity and Work for All, based out of the Philippines. And also, as Jen mentioned, we are also partners with the Just Good Work app from the 58 team. And so the FACT project brings stakeholders together to address a problem faced by many migrant workers known as debt bondage. Debt bondage occurs when workers borrow money to pay for their own recruitment to a job. Workers pay labor intermediaries for pooling and selection services. They pay government agencies for obtaining required documentation and medical exams. Workers also incur costs during transit to or from the host country. Workers are obliged to borrow funds to pay these recruitment costs, which leads to a risk of debt bondage and other exploitation. Debt bondage is considered a key indicator of forced labor. Matt mentioned the ILO indicators of forced labor. Debt bondage is a key indicator. And Verite's extensive experience tracing labor supply chains shows that most employers don't pay for the full cost of recruiting workers from communities of origin to the workplace. And as a result, migrant workers end up paying for their recruitment costs, essentially subsidizing the companies and brands that they work for. In the FACT project, we found that more than 90% of the workers that we interviewed faced a risk of exploitation due to debt linked to paying for their own recruitment. Despite the prevalence, there are currently very limited data collection tools or mechanisms to calculate the real recruitment costs paid by migrant workers. And I think the previous speakers mentioned that companies only take action based on what they know and what they don't know. So part of the FACT project, the aim of the FACT project is to make sure that we have a better ecosystem of data available to move companies in the right direction. While we're familiar, I've just described the worker pays labor supply chain where workers pay for their own recruitment. The International Labor Organization, along with a growing set of human rights due diligence legislation, are pressing companies to adopt an employer pays recruitment model to eliminate risks of debt bondage and related exploitation in their supply chains. This means employers, not workers, should pay for all the costs that I just listed, the recruitment agency fees, the visa and passport, the medical costs, the pre-departure orientation, all those, and travel, etc. Adopting an employer pays supply chain model requires companies have accurate measures of recruitment costs. They need to know what they need to pay for and how much it's going to cost them so they can plan their business around that. Companies have said that recruitment cost data is difficult to get, especially costs incurred in the sending country, the country of origin for the migrant worker, where workers face the highest risks and most complex pathways in their recruitment journey. So the FACT project has shown that it's definitely possible to gather this data accurately and transparently. And for this project, we focused on 2 corridors, India to Gulf Cooperation Council countries and Bangladesh to Malaysia, which I think you've heard about these migrant worker populations from others in the forum. But I just wanted to mention that we chose these corridors because we noticed that there's consistently high recruitment costs that are faced by workers in each of these corridors. There are legislative prohibitions either in the host country and or the country of origin on recruitment costs or worker paid recruitment costs. And we are also seeing that companies and brands are taking on human rights due diligence actions to address debt bondage risk. We're observing that the employers are starting to reimburse workers for recruitment fees, which is really just an initial remedy. It's kind of like a Band-Aid. It doesn't help the root cause of the issue, but reimbursing workers for recruitment costs can help address their exploitation as a result of debt bondage. So asking workers about their experiences with recruitment costs and debt is difficult because the topic is sensitive. What you paid, to whom you paid, how much you borrowed, how much you owe, what are the terms of the loan? All of this is very personal and private information that workers are often reticent or afraid to talk about for fear of reprisals. So we piloted a digital survey tool and learned that you can get more accurate recruitment cost data when you engage with organizations embedded in migrant communities. So we worked directly with organizations and worker-led organizations to build on a foundation of trust earned from the established relationships with those migrant communities in both the target corridors. Crucially, the digital survey tool we used was an extension of the ongoing interventions to promote safe migration, to increase awareness around debt bondage and other exploitation risks that migrant workers face during the recruitment process and after they arrive at the job. Data collection was driven by these worker-led organizations in India and Bangladesh, as well as Malaysia. Participating organizations developed mixed teams of novice and experienced researchers, and the survey tool was developed for anyone to use, and it did not require any specialized research expertise. Ultimately, we interviewed more than 600 migrant workers in 6 weeks across at least 4 countries, utilizing a purposeful snowball sampling method. That resulted in a sample consistent with the worker populations that we were trying to learn about. And the digital tool we developed and used resulted in clean, efficient, uniform data. This has made it easier to analyze than more traditional open-ended worker interviews or Matt and others mentioned audits. A lot of workers are interviewed as a part of an audit, but that information is not shared beyond the company. So this made the data available to a wider group of people. We also made sure that the tool that we were using to engage with workers used text and audio content in three different languages to accommodate for a range of literacy levels and user preferences. Having an audio function really helped improve the response rate that we got from workers. So we designed the survey for the 4 steps for working with recruitment cost data. And we designed the survey with key questions based on workers' priorities. We worked with community-based organizations to use this digital survey tool and safe migration app, and we mentioned Just Good Work, and short info videos for workers to guide them on their recruitment process. We analyzed and triangulated with similar data, and we found that the data that we were getting from workers, the amounts that they were paying for recruitment, are similar to what other sources of data have said that workers are paying, or the cost. What is the total cost of recruitment? And then now we've been having data-driven dialogue to promote the employer pays model for recruitment. We're trying to bring together the civil society and community-based organizations with companies and brands or private sector initiatives that are pursuing an employer pays model. So there's an increased demand for recruitment cost data. And so why does this matter in supply chains? So brands and their supply chains are affected by mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. So there's a new EU forced labor import ban. And companies are being asked to comply with this in the next 3 years or so, depending on the size of the company. But this is moving companies towards wanting to understand better and how to prove that they've paid the recruitment costs associated with their workforce and that their workforce is not susceptible to debt bondage. The U.S. forced labor ban has been enforced since 1930, but since 2016, we've seen a lot of increased enforcement by the U.S. Customs and Border Protection with withhold and release orders. These are also making companies and their suppliers in various supply chains around the world sit up and recognize that they need to start showing that they have paid the recruitment costs for the workers in their workforce. In Qatar, the law is that there is a recruitment fee ban in Qatari law, and FIFA was required to reimburse workers after it was found that migrant workers had paid for their own recruitment to FIFA work sites. So this resulted in almost $30 million being paid out to workers. But how do we know that that's a fair amount to have paid? The Amazon was reimbursed recruitment costs to workers in Saudi Arabia, almost $2 million. So this also was a result of the employers not being able to prove. You'll hear this term, proof of payment. If the employer can't prove that they paid, then we can be fairly sure that the workers probably did. And Malaysia's top glove, this is just another example, paid out $32.7 million in reimbursement to workers. But we don't know, because of there's been a lack of transparency around all of these reimbursements, we don't know if that is an accurate amount reflected in what the workers actually paid to get their jobs. So the bottom line is that for companies to take action, they need accurate data in order to implement human rights due diligence. What they know and they take action based on what they know and what they don't know. And with the FACT project, we're providing the data for them so that they can start to take action. And I'll just sum up here the advice for gathering accurate recruitment cost data if folks are interested. Things that we learned along the way. We learned that standalone surveys don't really work because the sensitive topics involved with asking workers about recruitment costs and debt require a kind of trust building with the worker community and working within the community, embedded in the community. And workers tend to not be as concerned with getting information about their rights so much as they want to learn more about how to make a successful migration and send more remittances home. So it's really key to exchange relevant information with workers as a part of the process of asking them the questions in your survey. Precision doesn't require research expertise. We found that worker-led data collection really worked, and we didn't need to hire specialized researchers to get this data. Also, avoid survey fatigue. You know, there's 1,000 questions we want to ask workers always about their recruitment experience and about their what they're facing in terms of exploitation. But a short, accessible survey works the best. That's what we have found. So I hope you will visit our FACT project website to download resources, infographics, videos, research reports in multiple different languages in English, Hindi, and Bangla. And I think that's all the time that I have.
Excellent. Thank you. And actually, with this, Brian, may I turn it back over to you for the introduction to the building a narrative and our good friend, Dr. Brooke Bello. I believe Dr. Bello will be closing us out, but she's a creative genius who's done so much work, and she's a good friend of ours in the movement, and she's been really taking the helm in a lot of this work. She's really been such a very, very busy activist and leader in this space. So we're so grateful to have her join us. And I know Brian's been working closely with her on the narrative. So I'll actually turn it over to Brian to finish the introduction and then over to Dr. Bello to close us out for the day. Thank you both.
Thank you so much, Davina. Yeah, so it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Brooke Bello to the Zoom stage, so to speak. We have this process has been ongoing, as she will just kind of give more detail on, since probably April of last year when we started working on this before the global forum that was held in Punta Cana, Dominican Republic. So it's a project that was initiated by our executive director, Bukeni Waruzi. And Brooke has been helping us facilitate feedback across the movement and really making sure that everyone's voices are heard as we go through this narrative development process. And we're just really happy to have her involved in this process. And so I would like to turn the floor over to Brooke to introduce more about the narrative and kind of explain about her session today. Brooke?
Hi. I guess I'll say good morning, everyone. It's about 4 a.m. or so here in Washington, D.C. And I've been up sort of itching since 3:15 a.m. to have some good alertness to be able to share with you. Thank you for all you're doing throughout Asia and your passion for wanting to, as we say here in the States, to end it and to reduce the numbers of all forms of exploitation. I'm so excited to be working and partnering with Free the Slaves. And yes, Davina was right. Brian did a really great job facilitating a little while ago. It was excellent. So I want to just give some support to one thing. I'm in Washington, D.C. at the NCOSI Summit. And one of the things we've been talking about, the COSI.org CISA Summit, I'm the founding CEO of an organization in its 20-year anniversary called moretolife.org. That's MORETOO life.org. And we've rescued over 12,000 victims of human trafficking and facilitated services all throughout the world, including and even the Philippines in the mountains. And so there is a list that NCOSI puts together called the Dirty Dozen. And I recommend that everyone go to dirtydozenlist.com to really look at the large companies like TikTok and Amazon and Google and Netflix and Etsy and what they're doing to really support things around this issue. And then the Dirty Dozen list, companies that we are working toward to change some of their processes. A lot of people don't really understand, even in our conversation here, the correlation between labor trafficking and sex trafficking, all the different forms of labor trafficking and domestic servitude. And as you may know, this narrative was done over 24 years ago. The original narrative was done over 24 years ago. And so because of that, our world has really changed, especially post the pandemic, and the facilitation and understanding of various regions around the world, various countries within nations. It is vast. And there's been sort of in the counter human trafficking exploitation movement, misunderstanding about the data, about the numbers, making it really difficult for other individuals to truly understand what is human trafficking, what is exploitation, what's the difference between labor trafficking. Is it 60 million, as they say, in terms of different forms of human trafficking? Is it 200 million as it relates to labor trafficking, some of the data from Walk Free? And how can anybody and everybody, governments, mayors of cities, governors of states, prime ministers of countries, and everything in between, and lay person and civil society really support this issue? And so this is why, and the importance of Free the Slaves, wanting to tackle something that is absolutely and incredibly complex and difficult, and individuals are extremely passionate about. And I think that at the launching in Punta Cana, in Dominican Republic, there was some passionate thoughts around sex trafficking, labor trafficking, because people don't always understand the correlation. Actually, a lot of labor trafficking victims actually experience exploitation related to sexual violence, rape, and even sex trafficking. And sometimes that's misunderstood. In addition to here in the United States, at the State Department, sex trafficking is legally a form of labor trafficking in terms of how you prosecute. And so understanding all these different terminologies, like modern slavery, is really important. But as we go through a little bit of the document, which you should have received from Aline or from Brian or Giselle, someone from Free the Slaves, and had an opportunity to go through it. Did any of you, let me ask, have an opportunity to read through the narrative a little bit already? Just give like a thumbs up or put something in the chat, so I know. And I know that with the fast moving sort of process of summits and conferences, some of you might not have had an opportunity yet. If you haven't, I'm actually sharing it on my screen. And so let me know that you can all see it okay. So I'm going to go back to the beginning because I was looking through it a little bit, as always. And so what we've done is at all the forums, we've had the session. Typically in person, the session is about 45 minutes. So we have a shorter time this morning or this afternoon or this evening. What time is it where you are? I'm sure it's the evening. But anyways, the importance of it is when you receive the document, when you go through it, you're going to be making comments. And your comments, as we facilitated throughout various regions around the world, is to really give your perspective regarding your nation, your region, and how you are addressing the issues of exploitation, human trafficking, labor trafficking, sex trafficking in all of its forms, and what are some of the pitfalls and challenges with the document. And so as we go through the document just a little bit, we're going to explain sort of the process in addition to the flow of it. And just so you know, I am a survivor of human trafficking here in the United States. And many of the children that were in the brothel that I was trafficked in were actually sent to different parts of the world. And so I come from this sort of origin of having a deep passion to reduce the numbers. And so here's the introduction. And so despite being one of the oldest sort of issues in human history and affecting more than 50 million, and we know the beginning of last year was 27 million. Now we've got to this number that's 50 million, even 60 million in some reports. People, modern forms of slavery receive limited global attention. In addition to the lack of public concerns, many governments and groups worldwide are not effectively acknowledging that modern slavery exists. within their borders and jurisdiction. And this is a true fact. And I'm sure if all of you relate to this, please give me a thumbs up, ask a question, because how you feel about the terminologies and the narrative will give you credence to be able to comment about any changes that we need to do, because this is about all forms and all voices. When we come up to the end of October, we want to actually complete a narrative that has all forms and all voices as much as possible. And we will have a closing out kind of Zoom call that brings individuals together, and then next year present this in Africa. And so while other global issues have gained significant traction in creating public will, partly due to their direct impact on human beings, the fears they raise in advocacy efforts to increase global concern, we have yet to see similar trend for modern slavery. Now, this next statement is something that sometimes I grapple with. It says modern slavery in all of its forms is estimated to directly affect less than 1% of worldwide populations. It might be over 1% when we think about 250 million, we think about labor trafficking and the numbers we don't know. And so even though that is there, as we undulate the narrative, that is one line as we rewrite that I'm still personally not comfortable with, because I don't know if we should even have that. Because in my opinion, it might minimize, right? The idea that it might be a small amount, but it's human beings are affected and the numbers are climbing. And so when we talk about framing a new narrative for the movement, social and political narratives are tools we can create and use to construct new social realities. And that's what this narrative is meant to do. And it's just a foundation because of the complexities, as you know. They have the power to entrench deeply held beliefs or transform how people perceive their social existence and those around them. So this is also about how this issue connects to everyone else in the world. And from your perspective and your comments, it's what's happening in your region, the background of the current narrative. And so though it was never formalized into a document or officially adopted across the various sectors of the movement, the current narrative surrounding modern slavery began with the focus on human trafficking. It emerged in the early 2000s with the primary focus on sex trafficking, almost only in a way. And over the last 2 decades plus, it has expanded to include modern slavery, forced labor, and child labor at the international agency and funder levels. And so while that's true and while that's really important, it's the foundation of why this is happening. The case study that Bukini and Free the Slaves and others sort of adopted to make it mass and global and to update it was the case study of climate change. And so like modern slavery, the climate change crisis is a negative outcome of human advancement that will require existence, development of public will to address the issues at a meaningful scale. The anti-modern slavery movement can learn much by observing how the climate change movement has approached the challenge of galvanizing public will. And so why that's important is climate change is the template that we have utilized to sort of branch this out globally as we roadmap different regions to really begin to understand how we can create a narrative that people can galvanize around, just as the world has galvanized around climate change and all the different forms of climate change issues that are affecting our world, whether it's flooding, whether it's pollution, whether it's recycling, whether it's clean and fresh water, climate change, whether it's heat migration. It's really important that they put that together. And because of that, people really have a good idea about climate change. And there's not really an argument that climate change exists on some level and that it affects us and will affect the posterity of people all around the world. So developing this new narrative, this history and process, I kind of went over that in the beginning a little bit. We talked about Free the Slaves and the extraordinary work of Free the Slaves and their supporters like Humanity United and Walk Free and those that really support these forms for Free the Slaves. Bukini had this incredible idea that it needed to be updated, and we have to commend him for that and Free the Slaves. and Davina and Brian and Giselle and Aline and the entire team, because this is a massive undertaking, and I am merely chairing the process with Brian to be able to just pull in all of your voices and all of your thoughts. And remember that this narrative is foundational. There will be many sub-narratives, demographical narratives, like the LGBTQ population, different things that will focus only on labor trafficking in certain regions. Someone may do one that focuses on agricultural labor trafficking. Someone may do one that correlates farm labor trafficking and its connection to sex trafficking. There are many documents, but we have to have some form of foundation, because it is said with the report from the Atlantic Council, Ambassador John Cotton Richmond, in the global work, that less than half of 1%, so that's 0.4% of human beings, have been discovered, rescued, and are being able to receive services in any form of exploitation. And that being said, while there are 8 billion people on the planet, maybe it's only 1%, maybe it's 2%, but the point is, we haven't even touched the tip of the iceberg of mining and finding and discovering these individuals. And oftentimes they don't even know that they are victims at all. And so this narrative development process began early in 2024, the end of 2023, beginning of 2024, from the Slave Reform series, which is really important, and the Freedom Forums. And this opportunity for me to be able to address this issue with you at all of the forums this year, moving into early next year for the sort of launch of the new narrative document, is really important. And your voice all throughout Asia is absolutely paramount. And so the purpose, we kind of already talked about it, is the development of a process that aims to facilitate the creation of a unified narrative, where those of us who are providing services and care globally, all forms, all voices, while even lay persons understand, how can I get involved in this? What can I do in my home, in my community, in my organizations? And so we know that movements succeed when they speak with one voice. The increasing complexity of modern slavery requires us to unite our issues and develop this cohesive global narrative. One of the things that was an issue, some individuals, we can't get around it, don't like the term modern slavery for different reasons. A lot of sex trafficking victims felt that their voices were not heard, and they were very demonstrative and passionate, and rightly so, about how they would be perceived. But it's important that we have all forms and all voices, and that's what this document is meant to do. And so we really, really need your help. Readers may find it helpful to envision this narrative as the trunk of a large tree from which many branches grow, providing detail and deeper context for the many aspects of modern slavery. These branches will form a more detailed and picture reflecting the movement's diversity and the complexity of modern slavery. And we have to drive that. We have to drive that forward, especially in different parts of the world and with all ages and all demographics. Now, the proposed new narrative, briefly, modern slavery is a systemic crisis that deprives at least 50 million, I might say at least 60 million people of their freedom, dignity, and dreams. It thrives in obscurity, preying on and exploiting the most vulnerable. We must unite our efforts to protect those at risk, hold traffickers accountable, and care for survivors. And this deals with all forms of exploitation, trafficking, child labor, all of its forms. This is the opening of the proposed new narrative. The culmination of every word here was taken from all the different forms, and dozens of individuals commenting and giving voice in a very passionate and specific way in what was good, what wasn't, what needed to change, what needed to be altered. But remember, some of your ideas, think of it as might be a part of a sub or additional document, really try to consider not just your region, but how your region, your nation, your country, your community, and its effect roadmaps throughout the world. And what are the issues that you see that are significant and that need to be added to this? The crime, the problem, modern slavery, trafficking in persons. And so we try to put together, based on everyone's voice and opinion, modern slavery, trafficking in persons, human trafficking are category level terms, often used interchangeably to describe the crime in which one person exploits and profits from another, whether an adult or child, by compelling them to perform labor, ultimately, or engage in commercial sex. We talk about the devastating reality that violates a person's human rights, their freedoms, their ability to dream and to discover identity and who they are. And we all know this to be true as we've worked with victims, and some of us are victims ourselves. When we get into some of the data here, this was all quite difficult to really pull together all the different voices. So let me read that. In 2001, we believe that 700,000 to 800,000 people, when this document was first created, 800,000 people were trafficked worldwide in all of its forms. In 2023, the Global Slavery Index reported that an estimate of 50 million, and some documents say 60, are currently trafficked or exploited in some form of modern slavery, a 7,000% increase, or a 7,000% increase in understanding of people enslaved over more than 22 years. Additionally, these numbers do not include the 160 million estimated to be exploited through child labor practices in 2020. But we know that has changed and aggregated in a negative way post the pandemic. And so after 2021, despite the staggering number of people estimated to be affected, the 2022 UN GLO TIP report estimated that only 53,800 victims of human trafficking are identified globally in 2020. Furthermore, it estimated that only 5,600 traffickers were convicted of crimes. And so we have this dichotomy of reasoning and understanding. And until we get to the root cause of the complexity and complexities and what's really happening globally, it'll be difficult to push the envelope on rescuing, on providing services and aggregating funds globally. So organizations like the ones you work for and I work for, and just nations and governments absolutely put the funds that are needed to address this issue and to prevent it. We don't just want to provide the cycle for victims that have been exploited, but we want to reduce the numbers. And I'll boldly say we really do want to end it. And that's what we have to push forward for. And so what you're seeing here is little bits and pieces that I'm sort of highlighting of the new narrative. Please take the opportunity to read through it and give a very honest and a very dedicated and a very, with all the intelligent intel you have, look and understanding. And we get to this, the last part of the narrative, it's really regarding the call to action. And as you read through that, that's something that needs to be expanded somewhat, but the call to action is also complex, and it should be something that kind of generally and pointedly talks about what has to happen. The increasing frequency of catastrophic events, such as climate change, economic instability, technological misuse, and I want to say even war and conflicts around the world, are highlighting vulnerability worldwide and continually increasing opportunities for exploitation. And through the use of AI, which is a call to action, and technology, we might be able to surmise where trafficking might happen in the future, and some of the areas around the world where it's going to be based on data intrinsic to being able to be prevented before war and before conflict, before issues around poverty and climate change. And so we must fight against all forms of exploitation that include all voices in developing solutions. We cannot allow the exponential expansion of enslavement and exploitation of humans to continue to be unchecked. A global community like those of you here, we have already surpassed our ability to pay the cost of these horrific crimes on people, communities, and economics. And so lastly, as we get past the call to action, we go into part of the narrative that talks about the way forward. Please take time and read through all of this. The way forward is a more unified movement. So take the time, read through it, really give all of your opinions around it. And we're so excited to be able to hear from you in the next 2 to 3 weeks while we pursue to finalize the narrative. I'm going to look in the chat to see if there are any questions from any of you. There is a link to the narrative that Brian just put in there, which is great. So you have it by email, but you also have it here. There's some other chats and stuff. I don't see any questions. So if there's no questions, here, there's one maybe. I don't know if this is a question for me. It says, even though we have a lot of programs on how we can prevent slavery, it's still increasing. So I'll answer that live based on the narrative, yes. And so that's where you would make a comment in the narrative about the increasing numbers. And you see a little bit of that in the bulk of the narrative that the numbers are increasing. We just did sort of the tip, the GLO tip that talked about the declining numbers, but then in the beginning, we talked about the numbers are absolutely increasing by over 7,000% and even more past 2020 during the pandemic and even now. And so some of that data that we put into the call to action as we finalize it may be there, but I think it's really important, Glenn, that we utilize that information as well and how it is indicated in your particular area, in your particular region. Thank you, guys. I hope I did okay. I put a little makeup on so I wouldn't look like I had just woken up. I hope I look okay. I can't tell. Have an amazing day.
Thank you so much, Brooke. We'll release you back to some much needed sleep. Thank you so much for your presentation and sharing all of this with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you much, everybody.
And that is the end of day 2 of the Asia Regional Freedom from Slavery Forum. So we would like to invite you to join us again tomorrow at the same time for day 3. And again, as we've noted multiple times, please add your feedback to the narrative document and come prepared for another wonderful day of information and learning tomorrow. Thank you so much to all of our presenters and panelists. We deeply appreciate you sharing your wisdom, and we wish you a good day.